When I first confessed to my father that artistic yearning, a chilling silence descended. Then his voice, hollow, echoed, "Hope you like buttered noodles, Eddie," a prophecy of sorts. I did acquire a taste for them, eventually, but his true meaning starvation, struggle. He was, God forgive him, correct. High school ended. College a distant dream. Instead, a descent into the drudgery of menial labor. Saving, hoarding, until San Francisco beckoned. Hunter's Point, a shared space, a purgatory with fellow aspirants. 18 months, a bleak eternity attempting to claw my way into the art scene. A harrowing period. Crime festered, drugs slithered. My meager earnings as a bag boy, a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. And the roommates a revolving door of spoiled progeny, squandering parental fortunes, feigning artistic passion while drowning themselves in pills and pot. Paints and pencils, mere afterthoughts. I knew, a visceral certainty. I had to escape, to earn, to find sanctuary. Another year amidst that debauchery madness awaited. The job hunt began, relentless, day in, day out, a month-long torment. Exhaustion gnawed. I felt the burn, the creeping urge to retreat, tail tucked, back to the familiar. To New York, to a fresh start, when the coffers were replenished. But then just as despair threatened to consume me, I met Greg, outside a liquor store. He needed a light. His face, a mask of utter desolation. I inquired. As I sparked his cigarette, he confessed impending doom. Firing, a missed deadline, a project agonizingly close to completion, 95%. But a graphic designer reneged. He lacked the logos, the vital symbols for some soulless financial firm. And so, in short, I provided the logos. An all-night vigil. A price far below the extortion demanded by those faithless designers. A fruitful partnership blossomed between Greg and I. From its fertile ground, I finally escaped that sty, that Hunter's Point hellhole. I began to breathe, to live as a human being. With newfound solvency, I sought a better dwelling, a single haven. Several promising apartments surfaced, each with their own allure, their own hidden flaws. I remained undecided until Mill Valley. The advertisement, starkly understated. 1 bedroom, 1 bath on shared property. That was all. But the reality a revelation. The apartment was a guest house, nestled on the grounds of a Mediterranean revival villa. Earthy tones, tiles, arches, columns, the familiar architectural tropes. I met the homeowner, an older gentleman, perhaps in his late 50s, early 60s. He led me through the guest house, a perfunctory tour. Then, the subject of rent. $650 a month. Unbelievable. A reasonable rate for such a place. Not suspiciously so, but low enough to offer a deposit and the first month's rent immediately. He seemed wary, hesitant. Perhaps my desperation was too palpable. He would consider it, he said. He would let me know. And then I told him my story, or a carefully curated portion of it. This was my chance, I explained, to grasp my artistic dream. I couldn't allow my nocturnal, drug-addled roommates to sabotage it. I offered $700 a month, then $750. The cut stung, but he wasn't interested in money, he insisted. He needed quiet, someone who minded their own business, someone who paid in cash on time. I swore upon every saint in heaven I would be that man, too consumed by work to notice the comings and goings of the main house. I wouldn't dare throw a party. This would be my workspace. He wouldn't even know I was there. The only evidence of my existence, an envelope brimming with cash. Arriving on the 1st of each month, I would be a ghost. He stood, silent, considering. Then he told me to collect the keys on the 1st. I could have danced down his driveway. Elation surged. Only one more week in that Hunter's Point pigsty. And on the 1st of the month, my old pal Greg offered the loan of his car too. Greg's car, a temporary chariot of liberation. I could move my belongings, severing ties with that wretched existence. The relocation to the guest house felt like a victory march, a turning of the tide. I possessed steady employment, a truly pleasant dwelling, and in Greg, I had found a steadfast friend, free from the parasitic tendencies of so many others. It truly seemed as though fortune had finally deigned to smile upon me. But as that long-dead philosopher whose name now escapes the labyrinth of my memory once posited, the path ascending and the path descending are often one and the same. A sentiment I have always interpreted as meaning that those very things we believe will elevate our existence can, in actuality, plunge us into depths far more profound than we ever imagined possible. The initial weeks within that guest house unfolded as though lifted from a dream. I remained unseen, unheard by the owners, and they, in turn, afforded me the same courtesy. I possessed ample space to dedicate to my work, and a tranquil sanctuary in which to rest my weary head each night. I encountered my landlord, Bill Harding, perhaps twice, perhaps thrice, during those first weeks. Yet, his wife remained a complete enigma. So much so, in fact, that I began to entertain the notion that they were estranged, that she resided elsewhere, far removed from the Mediterranean revival. Then, one day, a knock reverberated upon my door. Bill Harding stood before me, informing me that he would be departing on a fishing expedition over the weekend, leaving Friday evening and returning late Sunday night. "Okay," I replied. "Thank you for the information." But then, a subtle shift in his demeanor, a shadow passing over his countenance. Before departing, he imparted a piece of information that resonated with a disquieting "My wife, Eddie, is feeling somewhat unwell. If her behavior should strike you as unusual, do not be alarmed. She is simply not herself of late." A prickle of unease. It surprised me that she even resided there, given my prolonged absence of any indication of her presence. Still, I offered my gratitude for the warning and assured him of my willingness to assist should the need rise. This exchange transpired sometime midweek. Then came Friday. I observed Bill Harding loading his truck with coolers and various accoutrements for his trip. I offered him a cordial farewell as I made my way toward the guest house. The night unfolded with its customary quietude until approximately 2 o'clock in the morning. I concluded my work, intending to retire for the night. A necessary visit to the lavatory preceded slumber. It was fresco in the late summer, and I had thrown the bathroom window wide open, a desperate attempt to ward off the stifling humidity. Then, as I relieved myself, a sound pierced the silence, seizing my attention. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, yet it possessed a quality that arrested my senses. I strained to discern its source, its nature. Then, realization dawned. It was the sound of weeping, the unmistakable lament of a woman. I completed my ablutions and ventured onto the step outside my front door, attempting to triangulate the origin of the sound. I stood there, hands cupped behind my ears, a technique my father, Daddy, had imparted to me in childhood, transforming me into a rudimentary, red-headed radar tower. And as in those bygone days, the technique proved effective. I swiftly ascertained that the source of the weeping emanated from the rear of the main house, which could only mean one thing: Bill Harding's ailing wife, Eddie Jr. I was cognizant of Bill Harding's desire for privacy, and mindful of his warning regarding Eddie Jr.'s condition. But I could not, in good conscience, ignore such palpable distress, not without at least investigating. Once I had confirmed, with unwavering certainty, that the sound originated from the vicinity of the swimming pool, I cautiously peered around the brickwork. A figure sat upon a piece of patio furniture. I did not wish to startle her, to send her fleeing back into the house, so I softened my voice, attempting to project an aura of reassurance. "Ma'am," I inquired, "are you all right?" I anticipated a startled jump, perhaps a hasty retreat, but none came. She remained seated, her head buried in her hands, her sobs unabated. Assuming she had not heard me, I repeated my inquiry. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you require assistance?" Only then did the weeping cease. But instead of acknowledging my presence, Eddie Jr. turned her head, fixing me with a gaze. She peered out at me through the tangled strands of hair that obscured her face. But she remained silent. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable. I spoke a third time, identifying myself as the new tenant of the guest house, offering my assistance should she require it. At the very least, I presumed, my words warranted a murmur of acknowledgement. But again, Eddie Jr. simply stared, her expression vacant, almost as though she were not seeing me at all, but rather looking through me, into some unfathomable void beyond. I repeated my offer of assistance. But instead of replying, she averted her gaze, staring off into the distance, as though focused on some unseen dimension. She acted as though I had not spoken at all. I waited, patiently, anticipating some forthcoming utterance. When she rose from the patio furniture, I expected her to finally break her silence. But again, no words escaped her lips. She simply stood, turned, and walked back into the main house, closing the back door behind her. The entire exchange left me standing there, dumbfounded, grappling with the inexplicable nature of what had just transpired, but also deeply concerned for Eddie Jr.'s well-being. This was long before the ubiquity of cellular telephones, so there was no contacting and I needed to inform Eddie Jr., the new landlord, about what I had witnessed. But truth be told, even armed with a cell phone which I wasn't not certain I would have been so quick to reach out. He had emphasized, on more than one occasion, the sanctity of their privacy, the stricture against approaching the main house save for genuine emergencies. And so, absent such an emergency, my better judgment dictated silence. I already risked the landlord's wife relaying a tale of the new tenant creeping about in the dead of night. That wasn't my intention, of course. I merely sought to ascertain her well-being. But whose account would her husband credit? Mine, or that of the woman he'd pledged his life to? Besides, she was now ensconced within the house, as secure as any place could be, really. Thus, I retreated to the guest house, seeking the oblivion of sleep. The following day, a Saturday, offered respite from my usual grueling work schedule. I resolved to visit some of my old haunts in Hunter Point. I met up with Greg. We shared a few beers, exchanged baseball anecdotes, and parted ways around midnight. A cab delivered me home. As I ascended the driveway toward the guest house, a figure materialized on the second-floor balcony of the main house. A figure I was reasonably certain was Eddie Jr.'s wife. Only her silhouette was visible, cloaked in shadow, the bedroom light casting an eerie glow on the curtains behind her. Conversely, I was bathed in artificial light, each step up the driveway triggering the security lights affixed to both the main and guest houses. She could see me, I knew it. Or rather, if she possessed even a modicum of awareness, she could not have failed to see me. As I veered toward the guest house, I offered a small wave, a gesture of greeting. I'm not sure what I expected after the previous night, but just as before, she remained utterly motionless. A chilling thought. I remember thinking, how utterly bizarre is this woman? I was not about to stand there like a fool as I had done the previous night. I turned and walked toward the guest house. When Eddie Jr. had mentioned his wife's illness, I had envisioned a common cold or something equally benign. But now, I suspected her affliction was of a more psychological nature, and that realization sparked a whole new set of worries within me. What if she spiraled into some sort of crisis, and it fell to me to intervene? I possessed no knowledge of how to deal with such a situation, save for calling 911. And even then, would I summon the police? Emergency medical services? I would have been utterly lost. But in the end, it was she who summoned the authorities on me. On Sunday morning, the very day Eddie Jr. was due to return from his fishing trip, I left my apartment to procure some creamer from a nearby store. I saw Eddie Jr.'s wife standing on the front lawn. I presumed I was about to receive another silent treatment, as her back was turned. But as I drew level with her, walking up the driveway, she heard my footsteps and spun around. Startled, I didn't even bother to say hi this time, not after the previous two attempts. I simply nodded as she looked at me and continued walking. But instead of ignoring me, she began to shout, "Hey, you. What the hell do you think you're doing on my property?" I was shocked she even spoke to me. I had to bite my tongue to prevent myself from saying, "Oh, so now you're talking to me?" Remembering that she might be losing her mind, I kept my composure and politely informed her that I was the tenant, who had been renting her guest house for the past 3 weeks. The lady then declared she had no idea what I was talking about, and that if I didn't leave her property immediately, she would call the police. "Please don't do that," I said. I explained that it would all end up being a huge misunderstanding. I even produced the key to the guest house and offered to demonstrate my using it, so she would know I was not some casual home invader. Again, I kept my voice low and did my best to remain non-threatening, but she marched off, announcing her intention to dial 911. Shaking my head, I muttered to myself, at least this beats Hunter's Point, and then I went to the store and bought my creamer. Upon my return, I saw a police car parked outside the house. Rounding the corner to walk down the driveway, I saw Eddie Jr.'s wife gesticulating angrily to two very bored-looking officers. Eddie Jr.'s wife looked past them, saw me, and suddenly exclaimed, "There he is. That's him right there," as if she expected the officers to rush over and tackle me. Instead, one of the officers approached, his face etched with a weary patience, while his partner remained with Eddie Jr.'s wife, attempting to soothe her agitated state. I began recounting my bewildering experience, demonstrating how the key in my possession unlocked the guest house door. I presented my wallet, left conspicuously on the table after a minor withdrawal, along with other personal effects, all serving as undeniable proof of my residency. I made mention of Eddie Jr.'s wife's increasingly erratic behavior, emphasizing my usual avoidance of the main house and, consequently, my limited interaction with her. This, I explained, was the crux of my utter bewilderment. The officer then revealed that Eddie Jr.'s wife appeared to be heavily intoxicated, disoriented as to her husband's whereabouts, and even uncertain of the current day. In light of this, and considering the indisputable evidence within the guest house, the officers, albeit with palpable skepticism, extended me the benefit of the doubt. They escorted Eddie Jr.'s wife back into her residence, leaving a chilling silence in their wake. I then informed the officers of Eddie Jr.'s impending return from his fishing trip, assuring them that his wife would not be alone for much longer. This seemed to appease them, and they instructed me to contact them should any further disturbances occur before departing, their faces betraying a lingering unease. Hours later, Eddie Jr. arrived home, and I intercepted him in the driveway, eager to relay the bizarre events involving his wife. I omitted my initial approach to the house, instead stating that I had overheard her distressed cries, followed by her subsequent call to the authorities. He remained strangely impassive until I mentioned the police presence, reacting with a dismissive air until I detailed their inspection of the guest house. Only then did a flicker of concern cross his features, and he solemnly vowed that such an incident would not be repeated before abruptly departing, presumably to confront his wife. While I welcomed his apparent support, the unsettling manner of his reaction gnawed at my peace of mind. He seemed to regard his wife's behavior as a commonplace occurrence, displaying only mild disappointment. However, the mention of the police investigation seemed to trigger a disproportionate response, his demeanor shifting from indifference to palpable anxiety. It was as if he had grown accustomed to her outbursts, viewing the police involvement as an unnecessary escalation. But to me, it felt decidedly suspicious, his agitation stemming not from her actions, but from the officer's scrutiny of his property, even if it was merely the guest house I occupied. And needless to say, things didn't end there. I'd been residing in the guest house apartment for approximately 3 months when Greg arrived to collect me. We possessed tickets for a Giants game, an event I had eagerly anticipated. Given my lifelong passion for sports, I bounded into Greg's passenger seat, offering a cheerful greeting. But Greg appeared as though he had just witnessed a spectral apparition. "What the hell's gotten into you?" I inquired, my brow furrowed with concern. He responded with a question of his own, his voice barely a whisper. "You live in that place?" He gestured towards the guest house and the main house, encompassing the entire grounds. I confirmed, sure, emphasizing the advantageous nature of living in the guest house. Greg then inquired if I knew the owners, or more importantly, what had become of the previous occupants. I replied in the negative. Greg exhaled deeply, a sound laden with unspoken dread. As we drove toward Candlestick Park, he recounted a chilling tale. Approximately 5 years prior to my arrival in San Francisco, a high-profile missing person case had gripped the city, involving the daughter of a wealthy pharmaceutical executive. One day, she had informed her parents of her intention to walk to a nearby park and had never returned. The following day, after exhausting all possible leads, her distraught parents contacted the authorities, but no witnesses could be found who had seen her anywhere near the park that fateful day. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The girl's heartbroken parents held numerous press conferences outside their Mediterranean revival home, pleading for any information, insisting that someone must know her whereabouts and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Greg, a lifelong resident, had witnessed these news reports. As a high school senior at the time, the case had profoundly affected him and his peers, as the missing girl had been their contemporary, a fellow high school senior. When he pulled up to the house that afternoon and gazed upon it, a flicker of recognition sparked in his memory. He couldn't quite place it, but by the time I had settled into the passenger seat, the realization struck him. He had seen it in those press conferences. The missing high school girl was Eddie Jr.'s daughter. As one might imagine, this revelation cast a dark pall over our baseball outing, and we spent almost the entirety of that baseball game. The conversation revolved around the missing girl, the wife of my landlord, Eddie Pedore, and how everything suddenly clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The wife wasn't mad, or perhaps she was teetering on the brink, but the constant weeping, the silent vigils on the balcony, staring into the inky night, these were the actions of a soul, shattered by grief, likely submerged at the bottom of a bottle, be it liquor, pills, or whatever solace she sought. Greg informed me that the girl was never found, and after 5 agonizing years devoid of a single clue, nearly everyone had resigned themselves to the grim conclusion that she had been murdered by a suspect later dubbed the Golden State Killer. Hopes lingered that she had simply run away, that one day she would reappear, bringing a delayed but joyous resolution. Yet, deep down, everyone suspected a far more sinister truth. Something unspeakable had befallen that girl, and she would never return home. I felt a profound sense of sorrow for the landlord, Eddie Pedore, and his wife, wishing I had known sooner, so I hadn't dismissed the wife as merely a deranged old woman. But appearances, as they often do, can be profoundly deceptive. Weeks trickled by after I learned the truth about their missing daughter. It was then that I noticed a significant drop in my shower's water pressure. As fate would have it, this occurred on the very same day my rent check was due. I resolved to walk over to the house, deliver the check, and simultaneously inform Eddie Pedore about the diminished water pressure. I retrieved the check and made my way to their residence. But just as I was about to press the doorbell, I overheard Eddie Pedore engaged in a heated argument with his wife, their voices escalating into enraged shouts. I heard the husband, Eddie Pedore, unleash a torrent of anger, accusing his wife of perpetual self-pity, his tirade lasting for several seconds before his wife retaliated with a piercing scream, declaring, "I wouldn't be like this if it wasn't for what you did," to which Eddie Pedore retorted, "What I did? What I did? Have you forgotten that you were the one who got us into this mess in the first place?" It was at this juncture that I thought, this is an intimacy I ought not be privy to. I retreated to my apartment, scribbled a note concerning the water pressure on the back of the rent envelope, and then returned to the door to slip it underneath. The yelling had ceased, leading me to believe that their argument had simply run its course. I resumed my day as though nothing had transpired. Shortly thereafter, I mentioned to Greg that I was contemplating finding a new place to live. He replied that he wasn't at all surprised, stating that for him, it wouldn't even be a difficult decision. But that was easily said, as he didn't have to endure the reality of the situation. I surmised that the only reason Eddie Pedore was renting out his guest house was because they desperately needed the money, and because most people in the city were aware of the tragedy they had suffered. They must have struggled immensely to find a tenant, until my oblivious self wandered onto their property and remarked, "Oh, wow, isn't this a nice place if I were to abandon them now?" God only knew what financial hardships that might inflict upon them. I knew it was merely a few $100s a month, but for older folks, that sum could make all the difference in their retirement or in caring for a sick spouse. I knew I would feel like an utter scoundrel to simply leave them in such a predicament. Yet, simultaneously, I wasn't sure how much longer I could bear living in that atmosphere. It was as if a dark, oppressive cloud hung perpetually over the house, the very same one that had followed me home from the game that afternoon. And then, if one might permit a shift in metaphor, there was also the element of a ticking time bomb. Whatever the wife was taking to cope with her grief, it was either too much or not enough, and the intensity of their arguments led me to believe that it was only a matter of time before something catastrophic occurred. I had no idea what form that something might take, but I knew it was inevitable. And when it did, I certainly didn't want to be present for the fallout. Another few weeks passed, bringing us into late October, nearing Halloween. The house had remained eerily quiet. I had returned to never seeing the wife around. I was even beginning to question whether I had been too hasty in seeking another place to live. The place had its flaws, but so did everywhere else. And I was also feeling somewhat ashamed for making things about me when it was their grief, their burden to bear, so to speak. Perhaps the best course of action was to cease dwelling on it and remind myself that it was none of my concern. And that worked well enough until it became my business, and in a way I could never have conceived. So it was November 3rd of 1989, a Friday, as I recall, and I was preparing to step out for a few beers with Greg. I finished work around 4 p.m. and required about 15 minutes to get ready. Then, as I emerged from the guest house and began walking down the driveway, I saw a multitude of police vehicles turning onto the street. Emerging from the guest house, preparing for an evening's respite with Greg, I witnessed a phalanx of police vehicles descend upon the street. An unsettling premonition seized me as they advanced up the driveway, their uniforms stark against the fading light. A foolish impulse, born of nervous energy, compelled me to address them. "A little late for trick-or-treating, isn't it, fellas?" I blurted out, my voice wavering slightly. "Why don't you take off those costumes there?" The words hung in the air, instantly regretted. They registered my presence. A collective, almost mechanical response. Weapons drawn, holsters relinquished, a whirlwind of motion as they spun, leveling their firearms in my direction. The harsh, guttural commands to raise my hands pierced the encroaching twilight. I laughed, a hollow, desperate sound that betrayed the terror clawing at my throat. The laugh died stillborn in a moment of pure, unadulterated panic. Instead of a coherent plea, a strangled screech escaped my lips. It was a joke. It was just a joke. Their advance continued, relentless, implacable. The command to prostrate myself, to submit, echoed in the chill air. A sickening realization dawned, the landlord's wife. The second time. A wave of nausea washed over me as I complied, the cold, rough asphalt pressing against my cheek. Handcuffs bit into my wrists. I stammered, pleading for reason, for understanding. "Officers, there's been some kind of confusion here. If you just let me explain." Unlike the previous encounter, where a semblance of civility prevailed, I was met with a snarled command to silence. The indignity of arrest, the humiliation of being treated as a common criminal, ignited a flicker of defiance. Yet I maintained a facade of composure, calmly reiterating my status as a tenant. "There's been a misunderstanding. I rent the guest house on the property." Another barked order to shut my mouth. 2 officers escorted me towards the ominous black vehicle, while the others moved towards the main house, their voices murmuring about securing the premises. Silence descended. I nursed a fragile sense of smugness. This charade would end. I would file complaints. Each officer would answer for this unwarranted aggression. Once was a mistake. Twice, with such blatant disregard, was unacceptable. The old Mill Valley Police Precinct loomed, a grim monument to bureaucratic injustice. I clung to the belief that this was all a colossal error, but the booking process shattered that illusion. The charges were read aloud, each word a hammer blow against my dwindling hope. Suspicion of kidnap, false imprisonment, a litany of lesser accusations. And then the final, surreal pronouncement, practicing medicine without a license. Reason fractured. "What the hell are you people talking about?" The words erupted, raw and incredulous. Kidnapping, imprisonment were horrors of one kind. But practicing medicine? It was as if the world had tilted on its axis, plunging me into a waking nightmare. They might as well have accused me of treason, of witchcraft. The charges were utterly, incomprehensibly absurd. I invoked my right to silence, refusing to speak without legal counsel. The interrogation remained superficial until my attorney arrived. But even then, the focus shifted. The questions were not about me, but about my landlord. "Where is he?" The demand was sharp, accusatory. "Fishing trip," I replied, stating the simple truth. Disbelief. Suspicion. "Bull crap. We know he's not fishing." "Where is he?" the officer's face contorted with anger. A veiled threat, cooperation, or face the full weight of the charges, not merely as an accessory. A life sentence dangled before me, contingent on information I did not possess. I reiterated my ignorance of my landlord's whereabouts. He had simply stated he was going fishing, and I had no reason to doubt him. The interrogation continued. When had I moved into the guest house? What was my occupation? What was my relationship with the landlord? Was I close to him? I vehemently denied any close association. He had explicitly warned me to stay away from the main house, citing their need for privacy. If he was involved in something illicit, they were barking up the wrong tree. One offered my full cooperation in any investigation, eager to distance myself from the outlandish charges. Their demeanor softened, though suspicion lingered. They released me, but with a stark warning: do not leave town. Rearrest was a distinct possibility. They offered no explanation, only a cryptic pronouncement that I might not be seeing my landlord or his wife for some time, a circumstance that could impact my living arrangements. The prospect of apartment hunting loomed unwelcome and unsettling. But I was wrong. Wrong about that, and wrong about my theory regarding the police's intense interest in my landlord. The kidnapping charge, the implications of that imprisonment truly burrowed into my mind. As I boarded a taxi back to the apartment, it may sound utterly deranged, but the thought crossed my mind that Bill Harding might have somehow located, I don't know, the perpetrator who absconded with his daughter all those years ago. But then the juxtaposition of practicing medicine with the charge of kidnapping sent a veritable chill down my spine. Consider it. What manner of ghastly acts would one perpetrate to render such a combination? A relevant factor? Was he engaged in some form of torture? Performing clandestine surgery? Just what unholy machinations were afoot? The full horrifying truth would not surface until much later, but, as I must have reiterated ad nauseum by now, it defied all conceivable imagining. Devoid of a landlord to whom rent was owed, I remained in the apartment until the inevitable cessation of water and electricity, at which juncture I imposed upon Greg's hospitality, utilizing the guest house as a repository for my belongings until a new residence could be procured. This entire sequence transpired over approximately 2 months, with details concerning my landlord emerging in a slow, agonizing trickle until, at last, the disparate fragments coalesced into a complete, albeit grotesque, picture. But perhaps the most significant revelation occurred when the authorities located Bill Harding's daughter, not deceased, yet assuredly not alive, existing in some liminal state betwixt, in a modest rented dwelling nestled in Los Ranchitos. The police discovered Harding's long-vanished daughter, emaciated, confined to a bed and sustained by life support. She appeared to have languished in a profound coma for the preceding half-decade. Bill Harding had been maintaining his daughter's existence, apparently subsequent to her sustaining a grievous head trauma, and he had accomplished this through the utilization of medical apparatus, procured from some enigmatic, yet demonstrably well-resourced, benefactor, quite likely a consequence of his connections within the medical fraternity. But then, why not convey her to a hospital where she might receive appropriate medical intervention? Why consign her to a slow, insidious decay in some vermin-infested apartment secreted away in the hills? Because it was Harding's wife who had inflicted the crippling head wound in the first instance. I gather that the entirety of the sordid affair came to light upon their apprehension and the subsequent discovery of the daughter's location. I cannot ascertain who initially divulged the information, but someone did, and once the news broke, it became a sensational story for a fleeting few days, at least until the voracious news cycle reverted its attention to a more compelling narrative. The aftermath of the Loma Prieta earthquake and the multifarious rescue and reconstruction endeavors. 5 protracted years prior, my erstwhile landlord's wife and daughter had engaged in a dispute of considerable vehemence. The precise etiology of the conflict, I believe, was never definitively ascertained, but its intensity was sufficient to provoke the daughter into striking her mother across the face. Harding's wife, in a paroxysm of unbridled rage, seized a weighty ornament from a sideboard and, with a brutal, decisive blow, struck her daughter upon the head. It would seem that either the force of the impact was inordinate, or the blow was delivered with a particularly sharp edge, for the daughter lapsed into immediate unconsciousness, from which she never subsequently roused, and thereafter, rather than pursuing the morally upright course of action and consigning the mother to incarceration, they conspired to conceal the entirety of the incident, maintaining their daughter's existence in the hope of one day discovering a means of restoring her to consciousness. Obviously, they failed to effect such a restoration, and following a protracted, multi-agency investigation, Bill Harding was trailed to the Los Ranchitos apartment, where his bedridden daughter was ultimately discovered. I could scarcely credit that I had been sharing a domicile with individuals of such moral turpitude, and that I had rationalized all that I had witnessed and overheard to the point of actually experiencing sympathy for them. Their actions were reprehensible, unequivocally evil, yet they were perpetrated out of a warped sense of love and a misguided notion of familial preservation. And that is the aspect of this entire, lamentable situation that I find most profoundly unsettling. I do not believe that they were inherently malevolent individuals, but they committed a truly heinous act, both of them. And if ordinary, everyday individuals are capable of such transgressions, then it renders the world a significantly darker and more terrifying realm in my estimation. Back in the late summer of 2009, as I stood on the precipice of commencing graduate studies, the pressing need to secure a new flat for the forthcoming academic year weighed heavily upon me. Being a relative newcomer to the area, my familiarity with the various neighborhoods was rudimentary at best, and given my imperative to identify something both economical and agreeable, I found myself perusing vacancies in some of the city's less salubrious districts. Some of the listings were, quite frankly, terrifying, and I was frankly astonished that the landlords in question possessed the audacity to even advertise them. Others, however, presented as considerably more habitable, or at least they appeared so, courtesy of carefully selected angles and an abundance of strategically placed window shots. Over the course of a single week, I had scheduled 10 distinct viewings, and by the culmination of the third day, I was teetering on the brink of an emotional collapse, a playful exaggeration on my part, undoubtedly, but in all candor, the entire process proved utterly enervating. I had attended 6 of the 10 viewings that I had meticulously ranged, and each and every one had culminated in profound disappointment. The abodes were either riddled with insidious mold, obnoxiously proximate to a restaurant or bar, thereby saturating the air with the cloying stench of rancid cooking oil and stale cigarette smoke, or they were scarcely larger than a glorified shoebox. And, mercifully, my next scheduled viewing, which was slated for late in the afternoon of the subsequent day, was with a landlady who had advertised a females-only listing. The photographs of the premises depicted a rather appealing residence, and the prospect of residing within a segregated space, with its inherent security enhancements, held considerable allure. I am aware that such a preference may strike some as, I confess to a certain cynicism, a weary acknowledgement that not all men are paragons of virtue. However, in the context of the forthcoming account, I offer no apology for my jaded perspective or, as some women might more aptly term it, realism. The unfortunate truth is that some men are, quite simply, creeps, is an undeniable facet of existence. Thus, the prospect of residing solely amongst women in a shared dwelling held immense appeal. Then again, such an arrangement would, undoubtedly, entice virtually any woman embarking on a similar relocation within London. Surely, securing a viewing appointment would prove an insurmountable task. Yet, to my surprise, it did not. Within a mere few days, I received confirmation of a viewing, a stroke of luck. I initially believed, but in retrospect, a glaring crimson flag overlooked in my naive optimism. The following day, as the bus navigated its course toward Camden, a perplexing amalgamation of anticipation and trepidation consumed me. I harbored an almost unwavering faith in the property, bolstered by reassuring text exchanges with the landlady, a woman by the name of Jan. Confidence, therefore, held sway, tempered, however, by the relentless disappointments of recent days, casting a long, ominous shadow as my destination drew nearer. At the time, I attributed this disquiet to residual trauma, a lingering echo of past disillusionment, but now, I suspect it was something more akin to a preternatural intuition, A disquieting premonition. Upon disembarking, I promptly notified Jan of my arrival, a request she had made. Citing her demanding schedule and potential need for a prompt, an immediate reply materialized, but upon expanding the message notification, I discovered it was far more than a simple acknowledgement. "Hi, I've been terribly busy," it conveyed. "So my brother-in-law will be there to let you in and show you round." So much for a female-only environment, I mused, the very cornerstone of its appeal. I rationalized, however, that Jan, as the proprietor of numerous properties across London, was undoubtedly a woman of considerable commitments. I would not, therefore, succumb to childish pique over such a minor deviation. Resolutely, I proceeded to meet Jan's brother-in-law and inspect what might potentially become my new sanctuary. The apartments resided within a structure perched atop a row of shops. As instructed, I rapped upon the designated door. The portal swung inward, revealing Jan's brother-in-law standing sentinel in the threshold. His appearance was unsettling, to say the least, and the manner in which his gaze lingered upon me during our initial exchange engendered a profound sense of unease. Let it be known that I am no misanthrope, yet I harbored considerable reservations about interacting with a man within a purportedly female-only complex, particularly one emanating such an unsettling aura. Under any other circumstance, I would have summarily declined to enter an empty room in his company. But I had invested almost all my hopes in this particular abode. Summoning a veneer of courage and projecting a polite demeanor, I stepped inside and followed him toward the flat. The moment we crossed the threshold, my heart plummeted. The reality bore scant resemblance to the advertised depiction. Not only did it appear to be currently occupied, but I strongly suspected the images showcased an entirely different location. I inquired of Jan's brother-in-law as to when the current tenant was scheduled to vacate. My heart sank anew as he responded, "Well, yes, that's the thing. The property we were going to show you has been taken off the market, and this is the only one we've got available for you in this area. And it's a shared unit." The pronouncement was deeply disappointing, devastating even. However, paramount amongst my concerns was securing a residence and ensuring its exclusivity to women. I could, conceivably, tolerate a new flatmate, provided she was female. Yet, when I queried the man regarding the current tenant's gender, he conspicuously evaded the question. I posed the query with utmost clarity. "Is it still an all-female occupancy?" He countered with, "If you'd follow me this way, I can show you the vacant bedroom and attached bathroom." He then abruptly turned and strode toward the bedroom, as though my question had never been uttered. I followed, reasoning that I might as well inspect the room. While it was not entirely undesirable compared to some of the others I had viewed, he still had not addressed my inquiry regarding the unit's female-only status. I surveyed the bedroom, maintaining a facade of politeness as I reiterated my question. Was the unit exclusively occupied by women? The man equivocated, contorting his features in a manner that suggested uncertainty, before stating that he would need to contact Jan to ascertain the details, as he was not immediately privy to such information. My irritation began to mount, but I maintained my composure as he inquired whether I wished to view the attached bathroom. I teetered on the brink of declining when he advanced and flung open the door. An odor of truly revolting magnitude assaulted my senses, so potent that I visibly recoiled. I am certain he registered my reaction to the noxious stench. When I then declared, "No thanks, I think I'd like to have another look at the kitchen," I suspect he recognized the fabrication. Unless, of course, he truly was as stupid as he appeared. Honestly, I simply yearned to escape the pervasive odor. The state of the kitchen was of no consequence to me when the bathroom reeked with such bloody intensity. Thus, I resolved to proceed towards the front door, intending to offer a brief, albeit passive-aggressive, word of thanks before departing. But then, as I moved, a disconcerting realization dawned upon me concerning the arrangement of the flat's contents. By that juncture in my life, I had exclusively resided with women. Even in my formative years, my father was absent, leaving only my sister, my mother, and myself. Upon commencing university, my living arrangements remained exclusively female, and lest I be deemed indelicate, one possessed a certain familiarity with the typical state of male bedrooms, and it was this very familiarity that struck me with such force as I traversed the final flat. It bore the unmistakable hallmarks of a male occupant, and of course, I was cognizant of the fact that a man indeed resided there, given the gentleman's reticence in answering my direct inquiry. But it appeared that a particular type of man dwelled within, and it was here that I committed a grave error in judgment. I attributed it to the ceaseless disappointments and the mounting stress of believing myself condemned to select some utterly dreadful dwelling in which to languish for the foreseeable year. But when the realization struck that it was not merely any man residing there, but rather the very one currently conducting the tour, the pieces began to coalesce with alarming clarity. I retrieved my phone, dialed Jan's number, and addressed the gentleman who had shadowed me from the bedroom. His phone commenced to vibrate in his pocket. I was not meant to possess his number, was I? He was merely supposed to meet me at the location. Therefore, the commencement of Jan's texting device ringing within his very pocket served to confirm my darkest suspicions regarding this man, and he was acutely aware that I had penetrated his charade. And I lament the absence of a recording device, for the expression upon his visage was one I should have cherished, enshrined as a portrait to adorn my bathroom wall. I believe that this, too, played a role. How the first, I cannot articulate precisely, since his inherent vulnerability. I had apprehended a veritable wastrel attempting to ensnare desperate young women into inhabiting a spare room, seemingly self-constructed and possessing plumbing of questionable efficacy. Judging by the olfactory evidence, red-handed, that was the phrase that materialized in my consciousness, red bloody-handed, and I resolved that I would not permit him to evade the consequences. I recall endeavoring to formulate a witty rejoinder, but all that manifested was a repetition of my initial query, I suppose in an attempt at humiliation. And so, I commenced to interrogate him. Were you attempting to trick young girls into living with you? Indeed. His countenance flushed a shade akin to a ripe tomato, yet he persisted in his denials, and the sheer indignation I experienced at his continued deception only served to embolden me further. I proceeded to enumerate his pathetic nature, his perverse inclinations, and the likelihood of his inclusion on a registry of sexual offenders. I unleashed the full force of my verbal arsenal, withholding not a single barb, but I neglected the cardinal rule when engaging with men. They are larger, they are stronger, and those of diminished intellect are but one slighted ego away from exploiting this advantage. I witnessed the precise moment I propelled him beyond the precipice, and it mirrored that ubiquitous meme, and it was in that moment she knew she effed up. He ceased his protestations, abandoned his denials, and began advancing towards me with a wild, unsettling glint in his eyes. I knew his intent, and I gained a head start as I bolted down the corridor towards the building's entrance. But it was insufficient. I neared the door, my hand almost upon the latch, when I felt a sudden, sharp tug upon my hair. I felt the pressure against my scalp, and then my neck recoiled as the man grasped a fistful of my hair and attempted to drag me backward. I struggled to maintain my footing, but the force of his backward pull dislodged my equilibrium, and as I stumbled backward, I realized that he was, in fact, attempting to haul me back towards the flat, utilizing nothing more than my hair as leverage. I remember screaming for assistance, hoping that someone would materialize from one of the other flats, of which there were perhaps 3 or 4 on that particular floor. But if they were inhabited, the residents were either at work or deceased, for I screamed with such ferocity that my nose commenced to bleed, and yet no one emerged from behind any of the doors. Once I recognized the utter isolation of my predicament, and that we were mere feet from him dragging me back into his flat, I attempted to flip myself over, if only to regain my feet. But just as I found a modicum of purchase on the carpet beneath, I felt something slam into my face with such force that the vision in my left eye went entirely white. I brought a hand to my face, shielding the affected eye, and with my free hand, I made a desperately futile attempt to dislodge his grip from my hair. But the instant my hand made contact with his, and I attempted to dig my nails into the skin of his hand, he tugged violently upon my hair once more, sending me crashing down onto my knees. I remember as I reached the doorway, he tried to drag me through it, but I made it very hard on. With a surge of adrenaline, I lashed out blindly, a desperate flurry of kicks and punches. My sole objective, to inflict any possible damage, to strike his groin, to rake my nails across his eyes. Contact. I felt the impact of at least one blow. Then a void, a chasm in my memory, presumably carved by the brutal force of his counter-strike. A blow that plunged me into momentary oblivion. My last conscious act, a futile attempt to fend him off as we neared the threshold. Then nothing. The next sensation, the coarse texture of the bedroom floor against my cheek. A guttural sound, his ragged breathing, filled the suffocating silence. He was dragging me towards the bathroom. The air, thick and fetid, assaulted my nostrils, a miasma of mold and the cloying stench of decay. What unnameable horror lurked within that chamber? A searing pain pulsed in my neck. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced my consciousness. To resist, to twist, to bite, the mere thought conjured the image of my own hair, clutched in his fist, yanked with such force that my spine would snap. I was paralyzed by terror, a terror unlike any I had ever known. The situation was incomprehensible, a nightmare unfolding with ghastly precision. One certainty clawed its way to the forefront of my mind. That bathroom, it represented my absolute demise. Rolling, a desperate maneuver. A searing agony erupted across my scalp, the fiery protest of torn hair. But the movement allowed me to pivot, to seize his wrists. He had assumed me unconscious. My sudden action, a violent disruption of his expectations, granted me a fleeting advantage. I sank my teeth into the flesh of his wrist, biting with a savage ferocity until I felt his fingers loosen, until my hair was released from his grasp. Escape, the instinct screamed within me. I lunged, stumbled, but he was upon me again. This time, a primal rage consumed me. I launched myself at his face. He sought to pin my arms, to bind me with his embrace, but I anticipated his move, raising my arms before he could trap them. My fingers, claws now, found their mark. I dug them into his eyes. The sensation was abhorrent, sickening, the yielding softness, the rupture of delicate tissue beneath my nails. The memory alone makes me shudder, but then, in that moment, I was driven by a singular purpose, annihilation. It worked. His scream, a piercing, unearthly shriek, assaulted my eardrums. He recoiled, shoving me away with such force that I crashed to the floor, disoriented, struggling to regain my footing. But it was inconsequential. He, the man intent on my destruction, blinded by the agony of his ravaged eyes, could no longer see. He clutched at his face, his hands slick with blood, and howled obscenities, terrible, terrible things that I barely registered as I scrambled towards the front door. He could not pursue. I burst into the street, a desperate flight down the metal stairs leading from the unit. A woman, passing by, stopped, her face etched with shock. "Oh my God, are you okay?" A cut, the source of the earlier oblivion, marred my face. A gash that had been bleeding profusely, unnoticed until now. The sight of the blood, so much blood, ignited a fresh wave of terror. Had he stabbed me? I fumbled with my jacket, frantically searching for wounds, pleading with the woman to call the police. Call the police. More people gathered, drawn by my appearance, by the frantic urgency of my cries. I pointed towards the door, the portal to the nightmare I had just escaped. "He's in there. He's in there." My legs trembled, threatening to buckle beneath me. I was certain I was about to succumb to blood loss, to drift into unconsciousness, perhaps never to return. But it was the terror speaking, the primal fear distorting reality. Despite the alarming volume of blood, I required no stitches. But at that moment, I was consumed by a fear more profound than any I had ever experienced. Convinced that he had inflicted irreparable damage, the police apprehended my assailant. He received a sentence of 6 years. A paltry offering, I thought, a gross injustice. Had the jury been privy to the darkness that resided within him, to the horrors he had planned for me, his sentence would have been far more severe. But the law, alas, is blind to such things. And despite the trauma I now carry, my greatest fear remains that he will be released, that he will have another opportunity to finish what he started. The specter of prohibition descended in the early months of 1920, the federal government's Volstead Act casting a long, desolate shadow by outlawing the sale and manufacture of all alcoholic beverages. Eddie Sr., faced with this parched landscape, stood at a crossroads. He could have sought redemption, a path back to grace and sobriety. But the thought of a world devoid of drink, even if it meant financial ruin, was unbearable. He plunged into debt, owing money to men whose reputations preceded them like a chilling wind. They offered him a grim choice: weekly liquor runs to Chattanooga, across the treacherous Tennessee state line, or a final, suffocating embrace with a poplar tree. Eddie Sr. chose the former. He acquired an old Model T, tearing it down, rebuilding it into a roaring beast of an automobile, a mechanical hellion capable of outrunning any lawman's pursuit. A marvel of engineering, perhaps, but his driving skills were woefully inadequate. One night, with a revenue man's headlights burning into his rearview mirror, Eddie Sr. lost control. The Model T careened off the highway, a metal scream swallowed by the night, and slammed into an ancient oak. The impact, they said, was cataclysmic. The revenue men watched the inferno consume the vehicle, making no move to extinguish the flames. They simply waited, patiently, to see who would be reported missing. The wreckage left 17-year-old Eddie Jr. and his mother, Mary, facing a bleak future. Only one path remained open to them. Eddie Jr. would approach the very bootleggers who had employed his father and offer his services as an automobile mechanic. To Eddie Jr., his father had always been a figure of immense stature. From his perspective, the deadbeat drunkard had, in his final months, found a purpose, a way to bring home a steady stream of cash. Eddie Jr. had also observed his father's uncanny skill with automobiles, a talent that had captivated him since childhood. He might not have possessed his father's experience, but he was a natural choice for the bootleggers, a young man who would remain silent and fiercely loyal. Eddie was eager to follow in his father's footsteps, not just to provide for his family, but to earn the approval of a ghost. The money held little allure. It went almost entirely to his mother. Working with the bootleggers meant Eddie could spend his days immersed in the mechanics of automobiles, a passion that consumed him. But driving them, that was pure ecstasy. Once he had proven himself a reliable member of the operation, Eddie's bosses granted him the privilege of test driving the vehicles he repaired, to ensure they could withstand the rigors of a high-speed chase. It was then, ladies and gentlemen, that they discovered Eddie was a damned prodigy. On a makeshift racetrack carved into the woods, Eddie obliterated the track times of their most seasoned drivers. By the time he was 19 or 20, they entrusted him with liquor runs to Chattanooga, along the very route where his father had met his fiery end. Each night, as Eddie told his mother he was heading out, not to wait up, she would succumb to a silent, gnawing dread. She was one of the few who did. Whispers began to circulate among local and state law enforcement. The bootleggers had a new driver, a phantom. It seemed nearly impossible to catch. Some officers, bewildered by his audacity and skill, wondered how they could possibly apprehend such a driver. This new runner took risks no one else dared to contemplate. The police began to suspect the bootleggers had recruited a professional from out of state. Little did they know, it was young Eddie Jr. behind the wheel. Before long, Eddie's nickname evolved from Junior to Fast Eddie. Fast Eddie was bringing home money in staggering amounts, most of it going to his mother, he himself having little appetite for the liquor that fueled his newfound wealth. He had little need for it. He squirreled away his small share, letting it accumulate, only occasionally spending it on new shoes or a birthday present for his mother. Automobiles were his life. Fast Eddie concerned himself with little else. Then, one day, some of his fellow runners decided it was time for a bootlegger's bar mitzvah. They drove him to a cat house near Cohata to introduce him to the ladies of the night. Fast Eddie, a virgin in such matters, reportedly resembled a deer caught in headlights as the women lined up before him, each more alluring than the last. Eddie had the money to choose two, perhaps even three, but he selected only one, a girl his own age named Lily Mae. Little is known about young Lily Mae, only that she was an orphan who had spent most of her life in a notorious reformatory. Before finding employment at the Cohata Cat House, Lily Mae possessed experience. Fast Eddie did not. Then, true to his nickname, Eddie fell deeply, irrevocably, in love. According to those who knew him, Eddie spoke of nothing but Lily Mae for an entire week. Finally, He drove back to the Cohata cat house and announced to Lily Mae that he wanted to marry her. The cat house madam laughed. Heard the details then. The chilling pronouncement that $500 would purchase Lily Mae's freedom. It was set her face, already pale, drained of all color when Eddie produced the roll of currency from his very own pocket. And that day, they departed together, hand clasped firmly in hand. The tale continued, whispering through the town, that Eddie installed his mother and Lily Mae in a house on Alpharetta Drive, just across from the stoic facade of Maple Grove Baptist Church. A year, perhaps two, passed in relative tranquility. Eddie's occupation, the bootlegger's most trusted courier, remained a secret. Then came the storm, a deluge that turned the highway into a treacherous mirror. And for the first time, Fast Eddie, that man among drivers, lost control. His vehicle careened, a metal beast unbound, threatening to leave the road. He wrestled the machine to a halt, just shy of disaster. But the tires spun uselessly in the mud. He knew the law would be upon him soon. He abandoned the vehicle, fled into the concealing depths of an orchard. He paused, catching his breath. Relief washed over him. Almost. The photograph, affixed to the dashboard of that damned Model T. A picture of his beloved Lily Mae. Panic seized him. Eddie knew he had to disappear. The county sheriff now knew his face. And that sheriff, William Little Bill Harding, a man descended from generations of cruelty. His grandfather, a South Carolina slave catcher who fled the war's end. His father, Big Bill, a lawman of iron will, but also a sense of fairness. Little Bill possessed neither. He was a bully, pure and simple. Feared, yes. Respected, certainly not. To cross him, to wound his pride. A foolish mistake. Fast Eddie had been outwitting the law for years. The humiliation Little Bill must have felt, finding out who was driving those vehicles, making a fool of him. He would unleash hellfire on Fast Eddie Pedore. Harding and his men descended on Eddie's residence at dawn, tore it apart, looking for him. The house was destroyed. His mother and Lily Mae terrorized. But Eddie was gone. He still ran liquor for his cohorts, visited the house when he dared. But his true sanctuary, his hidden wealth, remained a mystery to Harding and the state revenue agents. Night after night, Harding's patrols haunted the highways, northwest of Georgia, waiting for any sign of Fast Eddie. Then, one twilight evening in 1924, two of Harding's vehicles collided during a chase. A deputy dead. Eddie witnessed the carnage in his rearview mirror. He knew it was bad. He pressed on, delivering his illicit cargo. The bootlegger's routine. Deliver in one vehicle, return in another. A less conspicuous machine. A different route. Eddie did not return home until dawn. He would then retire to his hideout, sleep until the late afternoon. But this morning, an unease settled in his stomach. He had to see his mother, Lily Mae. Usually, upon his return from a run, the scent of a southern breakfast hung heavy in the air. Sizzling sausage, bacon fat, fried apples, a symphony of comfort. But this morning, only the metallic tang of blood. Eddie's mother, gone. The bathroom, a porcelain tub, stained crimson. Lily Mae, dead. Her skull fractured by one of Eddie's lug wrenches. A note on the bath mat. I didn't mean to hurt her. Signed, Edward Pedore, Jr. Little Bill Harding had extracted his revenge, framing Fast Eddie for the murder of his beloved. Eddie was accustomed to being hunted, but now, branded a killer, he did not know who to trust. I have no doubt Harding and his men anticipated retaliation. Perhaps they even feared it. But as the days passed, and no sign of Fast Eddie appeared on the highways, the local lawmen began to believe he had simply fled. Though not everyone believed Eddie murdered Lily Mae, enough did. And he was no longer seen as a folk hero. And without, hunted, cornered by the very sympathies he once relied upon, Fast Eddie Pedore had no recourse but flight. Months bled into one another. A seemingly innocuous Sunday afternoon found a pair of deputies languidly stationed within the confines of the Varnal Sheriff's Department. The oppressive silence of the day was shattered by the insistent blare of a car horn, emanating from the parking lot. They anticipated no visitors, assumed the clamor was intended for some employee within the city offices, across the expanse of asphalt. But the driver persisted. relentless in their assault upon the quiet. The incessant honking finally drew Sheriff Bill Harding from his office. He emerged with a thunderous decree, ordering the deputies to silence the offender under threat of arrest. The deputies, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs, ventured outside. There, idling in the sun-drenched parking lot, was no ordinary vehicle. It was a stripped-down Buick Master 6, savagely refitted with a state-of-the-art V8 engine, and behind the wheel sat Fast Eddie Pedore. A cold dread, a premonition of unspeakable horror, washed over the deputies. They spun on their heels, fled back into the sanctuary of the office, their voices a panicked chorus, announcing the arrival of Edward Lee Pedore Jr. himself. Harding, his face a mask of fury and mounting terror, burst forth just in time to witness Fast Daddy peeling out, heading southbound towards Tunnel Hill Road. A guttural roar escaped his lips as he scrambled to his own vehicle. He and the two deputies gave chase in 3 separate cars. A desperate, ill-fated pursuit. Harding knew in his bones that, in times past, he and his men could never hope to overtake Fast Eddie. But the preceding months had been dedicated to a grim task, the methodical stripping down of their own pursuit vehicles, lightening them, making them lean and predatory, until they were almost ready to contend with the greased lightning that was Fast Eddie's trademark. This time, they were prepared, or so they believed. The sheriff and his boys tore down the highway, the speedometer needle flirting with the 100 miles per hour mark, intent on maintaining that breakneck pace until Fast Eddie's Buick materialized on the horizon. 15, 20 miles they hurtled onward. Each time, a fleeting glimpse of a car ahead, a surge of adrenaline, only to find some innocent citizen clinging to their steering wheel, their faces contorted in terror as a cacophony of sirens and screaming engines engulfed them. They pressed on, praying they hadn't squandered their opportunity. And then, a dark speck appeared on the horizon. Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered within Harding's chest. Was it Fast Eddie? He pushed the engine of his stripped-down car to its absolute limit. He did not have long to wait. What transpired next unfolded in a mere 2 or 3 seconds, an eternity compressed into heartbeats. Harding spotted Eddie. As the dark speck grew, swelling in size with terrifying speed, a fleeting, delusional thought crossed the sheriff's mind. He was catching up, but Eddie wasn't fleeing. He was hurtling towards him. By the time Harding grasped the horrific truth, it was too late. Too late to react. Too late to save himself. Fast Eddie smashed that Buick into Harding's Model T at a speed approaching 110 miles per hour, with the sheriff's own vehicle already scraping against the limits of sanity. The impact was apocalyptic. Both cars disintegrated, erupting into a maelstrom of twisted steel, razor-sharp shrapnel, and shattered glass. An instant inferno that claimed the lives of both Fast Eddie and Sheriff Harding. Secondary impacts left one deputy so grievously wounded that both of his legs required amputation. The news reverberated through Whitfield County like a thunderclap. Harding murdered. Fast Eddie the perpetrator. The very air crackled with disbelief and morbid fascination. Some whispered that Eddie was a depraved delinquent, a wife slayer, a cop killer, perhaps even a matricide, given his mother's continued absence. Others clung to the notion of a tragic accident. Eddie was many things, they conceded, but a bad driver he was certainly not. While all agreed on the unexpected nature of the event, another certainty permeated the atmosphere. Fast Daddy Pedore's funeral drew a considerably larger crowd than Bill Harding's. Those who truly knew him refused to believe Eddie had murdered Lily Mae, but the headlines had poisoned the minds of the masses. To them, he was nothing more than a villain, a no-good wife slayer and a cop killer. Most people didn't give a damn what anyone had to say about Eddie. But there was one person who cared enough to salvage his reputation. Sometime later, a night train arrived at Atlanta's terminal station, coming all the way from Washington, D.C. From the first-class car emerged one of the most accomplished prosecuting attorneys on the entire eastern seaboard. He was there to meet face-to-face with an old classmate from Yale, who'd since taken a high position in the Georgia state government. Over lunch, the two men shared shrimp cocktails and pan-fried chattabon at the Capital City Club. That very same afternoon, a team of agents from the Bureau of Investigation arrived in Varnal. and began interviewing the new sheriff and the deputies who'd once served under Harding regarding the murder of one Lily Mae McDermott. They reviewed evidence, re-interviewed the deputies, and sought out character witnesses for both Fast Eddie and Sheriff Harding. Then by month's end, they turned up the heat so bad that one of the deputies finally cracked and agreed to testify against his fellow officers in exchange for avoiding the state's brand new method of execution, the electric chair. The governor claimed the electric chair was the bleeding edge in dispatching murderers both quickly and painlessly, and after a period of rigorous testing, the details of which remain best unsaid, the chair ascended to become the state's primary instrument of execution. But then a disquieting whisper slithered through the ranks, carried by a boy agent, a serpent in the garden of their convictions. He spoke of the chair not as a swift passage, but as a crucible of torment. He claimed to have witnessed its ghastly work firsthand, even against the backdrop of the unspeakable horrors he had seen in the trenches of France. He insisted the electric chair was the most appalling, the most haunting spectacle he had ever encountered. He preyed upon the deputies' minds, painting vivid portraits of men cooked alive, their screams echoing in the sterile chamber, their pleas to non-existent mothers a symphony of despair. Blistered skin, boiling eyes, a macabre ballet of agony. He spoke of one who had burst into flames, another who wept tears of blood, and a third who endured an eternity of excruciating pain, his body betraying him in the most humiliating ways, until his heart, finally overwhelmed, exploded in his chest. The implication hung heavy in the air. If one of them did not confess the truth about Lily Mae, they would all be condemned to that infernal device, destined to burn. It seemed only a matter of time before the pressure fractured one of them, and when it did, the entire edifice of lies collapsed. No one ultimately met their end in the electric chair. All testified that it was Sheriff Harding who had wielded the lug wrench and forged the false confession. At their sentencing, the judge made no attempt to conceal his disgust, voicing his bewilderment that men sworn to uphold the law had so readily abandoned it. But another question lingered in his mind. What force had compelled the ambitious prosecutor to journey from Washington, D.C. to a case deemed unlikely to succeed? The attorney then revealed the presence of their wealthy benefactor. Seated in the courtroom gallery, a woman cloaked in black, her face hidden behind a long, dark veil. As all eyes turned towards her, she slowly lifted the veil. Though not all recognized her, a collective gasp arose from those who did. It was Mary Podomore, the grieving mother of Fast Eddie. Like her son, Mary had lived a life of frugality. Despite possessing a nest egg of nearly $500,000, a sum equivalent to almost $10 million in today's currency, her philosophy was simple: easy come, easy go. Rather than risk attracting attention to her family's hidden wealth, she allowed the money to accumulate, waiting for the day when she would have a purpose to spend it. And spend it she did. This led her to Washington, D.C., where she used her amassed fortune to navigate the corridors of power, eventually finding herself in the office of the prosecutor, who had brought down the Whitfield County Sheriff's Department. She tasked him with clearing her son's name, a mission he accomplished with a flourish. The revelation brought solace to those who cared for Eddie, but in the broader scheme of things, it changed little. Those who loved him continued to do so, and those who didn't remained unmoved. Little Bill Harding was now officially branded a murderer, but he was dead, hated in life and then in death, and Eddie was also dead. The news resonated with in-state law enforcement, but it barely registered in Whitfield County. The sheriff's department was hardly eager to publicize the events, and there was no official apology, not as there would be today. Perhaps that is why this story is still told, to ensure that the truth of what transpired between Fast Eddie, Little Bill, and Lily Mae is not forgotten. For a man does not truly die when he passes away. His true death comes when there is no one left to remember him, when the final memory of him flickers and fades, leaving him forever lost to the shadows of oblivion. I do not know how we lost Afghanistan. As a former Army officer who served for 14 years with the 503rd Infantry Regiment, I feel I should possess some coherent explanation for how one of the most powerful and technologically advanced militaries on Earth simply turned and fled. But I do not, and in the coming decade, countless books, films, articles, documentaries, and television specials will attempt to dissect the events of the summer of 2021. They will speak of rumors of a Taliban resurgence, of towns falling one by one, of the encirclement of CPL. They will draw parallels between innocent Americans plummeting from the 100th floor of One World Trade Center and innocent Afghans falling from the wheel wells of a departing C-17. But it will take a long, arduous process to fully comprehend how the world's finest fighting force managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. That is a task beyond my individual capabilities. What I can offer is an account of how the United States lost one specific district, nestled in the mountains of Kunar Province, Asadabad. Asadabad is the smallest of Kunar's 16 administrative districts, comprising a small village of the same name and a narrow, fertile valley carved by the Kunar River. It is home to approximately 35,000 people, a third of those who dwell within the village proper. The remainder are scattered throughout the valley floor, residing in mud-brick compounds that whisper of a past nearly a millennium old. It is, by most measures, an unremarkable locale in eastern Afghanistan. Should that assessment lack clarity, envision skies of crystalline blue, vistas of breathtaking semi-alpine beauty, and a poverty so profound it grinds against the very soul. Yet, what lent Asadabad a certain notoriety was its district center's mere 7-mile proximity to the Pakistani border, a geographical quirk that rendered it a vital artery for the Taliban's illicit trade in weaponry and opium. I am aware that the Taliban, upon seizing power, embarked on an ambitious public relations campaign, making much of their supposed eradication of Afghanistan's poppy fields to underscore their purported aversion to vice. But when the coffers ran dry and the need for weapons and ammunition grew acute, moral pronouncements proved remarkably flexible. The Taliban evinced no compunction about permitting opium traffickers to ply their nefarious trade, provided, of course, that a substantial cut of the profits found its way into their coffers via the imposition of exorbitant taxes. And make no mistake, they amassed a considerable fortune through this unholy alliance. Thus, in the frigid winter of 2008, we, with heavy hearts, rolled into Asadabad with the grim determination to sever these smuggling routes. The initial obstacle we encountered was the pervasive corruption of Asadabad's chief of police. He was, in essence, a man consumed by avarice, accepting bribes from the Taliban to ensure his officers remained conspicuously absent from strategically sensitive areas. He was also in the pay of the smugglers, turning a blind eye to their clandestine operations in exchange for considerable sums. Furthermore, he was receiving funds from a particularly ruthless and well-organized group of insurgents, known as the Haqqani Network. The rationale behind these payments, however, remained shrouded in mystery. Despite our most diligent efforts to unravel it, we knew only that they were occurring, and so the first order of business became finding a suitable replacement. While the 503rd bore responsibility for the combat and supply aspects of the operation, the entirety of the civilian administration fell under the purview of the Department of State. The DOS maintained a headquarters in Kabul, and periodically, a representative would arrive via Chinook helicopter to lay eyes with our battalion commander. Then, one fateful day, the familiar thud of a Chinook echoed through our battalion headquarters. But the representative was not alone. He had brought with him the chief of police's replacement, a man named Najibullah. Chief Najibullah hailed from a large family who, for reasons never fully articulated to us, had been forcibly expelled from Asadabad many years prior by the Taliban. Najibullah and his kin harbored a deep-seated and implacable hatred for these oppressors, and we harbored a quiet confidence that they would prove far more effective than their predecessors, who had possessed an uncanny knack for vanishing whenever the Taliban launched an assault. With a greater concentration of Taliban fighters committed to Asadabad, it would, in theory, become considerably easier for the Green Berets to descend upon the smugglers' transport routes and effectively choke off the enemy's primary source of revenue and resupply. At least, that was the meticulously crafted plan. But whenever I dwell on the subject of plans these days, I am inevitably reminded of a poem I committed to memory during my time at West Point. But little mouse, you're not alone. In proving foresight may be vain, the best laid schemes o' mice and men gang aft agly, and lee us naught but grief and pain. For promised joy, for the initial weeks, Najibullah and his officers performed precisely as we had hoped, proving a significant improvement over the police force the previous regimental combat team had been forced to contend with. The presence of Afghan National Police officers actively performing their duties injected a fragile, but desperately needed layer of security into the district. The Taliban found themselves increasingly hampered in their movements, struggling to evacuate wounded combatants and to resupply their key firing positions. During engagements, as one might imagine, this development significantly streamlined our offensive operations, enabling us to make substantial progress in curtailing the flow of weapons and opium across the border with Pakistan. Najibullah was a formidable man, possessed of a considerable ego, but his impact on our area of operations was undeniably phenomenal. For a time, we were all fervent admirers, but as winter relinquished its grip and the spring fighting season drew inexorably closer, we began to observe a disquieting shift in Najibullah's methods of law enforcement, a shift that could only be described as increasingly robust, for want of a more palatable term. One morning, approximately midway through February, word filtered down the chain of command that a village elder had made his way to Battalion HQ to lodge a formal complaint against Najibullah. The chief, accompanied by several of his officers, had been conducting a search of a compound in the valley when a young boy dared to speak back to him. Najibullah, consumed by an uncontrollable rage, began to strike the child with brutal force. When the boy's father intervened, demanding that he cease his assault, Najibullah callously ordered one of his officers to hold the father at gunpoint, while he continued to beat the man's son with even greater ferocity. By the time the village elder arrived at Battalion HQ, the grievously wounded boy who, as it turned out, was the elder's great-nephew, had been transported to the small medical clinic near Asadabad's district center, where he was receiving treatment for a fractured eye socket and a severe concussion. The village elder then recounted how he had managed to dissuade the boy's father from seeking immediate retribution against Najibullah and his officers, but that, in order to ensure a lasting peace, he would require substantial monetary compensation. If there was one commodity that was never in short supply in Afghanistan, it was cash. Securing the necessary funds for the elder and his family would never be the problem. The problem was the already tenuous goodwill we had with the local Afghans. And so, after arranging for a family representative to discreetly collect the agreed-upon sum, a few officers journeyed to the district center to speak with Najibullah regarding his conduct. But when confronted with the allegations, he appeared genuinely perplexed. Through the translator, Najibullah explained that as part of his training, he'd been instructed to instill respect within the populace. But how, he queried, could he garner respect if not through fear? As the spring fighting season loomed, we painstakingly convinced Najibullah that apprehension of arrest and confinement should be the instrument of control, not barbaric corporal punishment or death. He swore that he and his officers would adhere to the procedural guidelines we furnished, apprehending all future suspects rather than resorting to immediate, brutal beatings. I overheard one officer lament that dealing with Najibullah was akin to extracting teeth, though, in truth, it felt more like herding feral cats. Despite the exhaustive guidance provided to the A&P personnel, they remained stubbornly independent, often pursuing their own agendas. Though, on occasion, their unconventional methods proved surprisingly effective. I recall an incident when they returned to the district center, laden with several kilos of raw opium seized from smugglers ambushed into surrender, without a single shot discharged. I remember questioning Najibullah about the rationale behind such a perilous undertaking. His chillingly nonchalant response, boredom. Such audaciousness was not uncommon among the Afghans, and on numerous occasions, it spared the lives of my own soldiers. Yet, conversely, their reckless actions frequently bordered on catastrophic. One morning, the men of 2nd Platoon executed a preliminary advance-to-contact patrol at the valley's western extremity. These patrols mirrored the search-and-destroy missions of Vietnam, with soldiers venturing deeper into enemy territory until provoked by hostile fire. The ensuing gunfire served as confirmation of their trajectory, prompting them to advance under fire, neutralize or rout the Taliban, and then retreat to their operating bases for the solace of coffee and MREs. There existed a particular locale where, with near certainty, we would invariably encounter a K-fire upon arrival. But on this specific morning, an unsettling silence pervaded the landscape. The Taliban were conspicuously absent. It marked the first instance in which we had reached that westernmost point in the valley without encountering enemy fire. Understandably, we were acutely interested in discerning the cause of this anomaly. My platoon retraced its steps to our FOB, whereupon a detachment comprising myself and several men from 2nd Squad journeyed to the district center to deliver a comprehensive, in-person report to the lieutenant colonel regarding the morning's events, or more precisely, the morning's non-events. Upon entering the compound housing the district center, a collection of administrative buildings, we observed some of Najib's men lounging, smoking cigarettes, and drinking chai. This was not unusual, as it was approaching the hottest part of the day, when the Afghans traditionally took respite. But as we passed, offering our salams, one of them uttered in broken English, Taliban, Finnish, "Captain, today, Taliban go home. No fighting." My men and I froze, our movements arrested as if by an unseen force. Wait, what? How did they know? The jeep's occupants sported broad, unsettling grins. It was conceivable that they, too, had noted the morning's absence of Taliban fighters. But those self-satisfied grins suggested an awareness beyond mere observation. Upon entering the room serving as the lieutenant colonel's daytime office, we found Najib smiling with the smugness of one who had discovered an unexpected windfall. It transpired that during the preceding night, he and his men had ventured into the valley and paid a visit to one of the compounds therein. They had not forced entry, nor had they inflicted any physical harm. In fact, their sole action had been the arrest of a villager suspected of providing information to the Taliban. The lieutenant colonel recounted these events, which initially seemed like positive developments. Yet, the disquiet etched upon his face hinted at a more troubling narrative. And how right that premonition was. The suspect Najibullah had apprehended was none other than the mother of the Asadabad Taliban commanders. In all likelihood, she had indeed provided her son with some form of material support. But prior to that day, women and children were considered inviolable. A brother or father aiding in the construction of an IED could anticipate being transported to Kabul for an extended stay in Pulicharki prison. But to tamper with Afghan women, or worse, their children, was to invite grave consequences. But if Najib had merely arrested some commander's mother, why wasn't the entire valley erupting in RPG and mortar fire? The answer lay in the message Najib had instructed the woman's family to relay to the Taliban commander should a single bullet be fired from a Taliban rifle, or a single IED detonate anywhere within the valley. The commander's mother would be subjected to torture, violation, and ultimately execution. We inquired as to whether Najib possessed proof of the mother's material support, to which he retorted with a question of his own. Why did we require it? He asserted that her son's affiliation with the Taliban was common knowledge, and that, in his view, constituted sufficient justification. He declared, through the translator, that if we desired to vanquish the Taliban, we must strike them where it caused the most profound pain. I was then compelled to reiterate, again through the translator, that such tactics were antithetical to our objectives. We had conveyed this sentiment to Najib countless times. Our aim was to win hearts and minds, and to minimize our contribution to the cycle of violence in our efforts to dislodge the Taliban. Therefore, lacking any tangible evidence of her culpability, he would be required to release the Taliban commander's mother, and Bill Harding was compelled to act immediately. Needless to say, Najibullah was far from pleased at being ordered to release his prisoner, leveling accusations that we were actively undermining his authority. A chilling pronouncement followed. The moment the commander's mother reached safety, the Taliban would unleash a devastating assault upon our positions. And, disturbingly, he was correct. We found ourselves in the unenviable position of explaining how, when this inevitable attack occurred, it would be entirely his fault. But the alternative, continuing to hold her prisoner, would invite consequences far graver than any we could currently foresee. The instant we returned the commander's mother to her compound, a palpable wave of fear washed over the valley. Families, gripped by an unseen terror, began dismantling their lives, packing their meager belongings, and fleeing the Asadabad Valley, seeking refuge elsewhere. They knew what horrors were approaching. We knew it as well. And when the storm finally broke, we stood ready. The assault, a reckless and desperate act of vengeance, saw the Taliban hurl themselves against every forward operating base we possessed, all while raining down a relentless barrage of 82 and 120 millimeters mortar rounds upon the district center. Yet their haste proved to be their undoing. We tallied a grim score, 33 Taliban killed while suffering a mere single wounded soldier. It was, without question, the most intense and sustained firefight we had yet experienced. A veritable turkey shoot. But then who should step forward to claim the glory but Naji Goddamn Bola himself? He brazenly asserted that it was he who had cunningly lured the Taliban into this hasty and disastrous attack, all through the simple act of feigning the arrest of one of their commander's mothers. And the most infuriating aspect was that the villagers, steeped in their own fears and superstitions, believed every word. It is not to suggest that Najib and his men did not stand their ground, did not fight with a ferocity that bordered on madness. They did. And those civilians who had not yet abandoned the district center bore witness to their efforts. But instead of acknowledging it as a shared victory, Najib twisted the narrative into a grand public relations triumph for himself. A turn of events that, in all fairness, delighted those further up the chain of command. They were, after all, relying on him to cultivate the villagers' respect. And having seemingly achieved this, Regimental Command issued a clear directive. We were to back off, allow him his moment, and focus our energies on consolidating the strategic advantage gained from our recent victory. And so, we complied. But once he realized he was operating without oversight, Najib not only reverted to his less than scrupulous practices, but plunged into depths of corruption previously unimaginable. The first chilling sign manifested when we took several of Najib's men with us on a routine patrol. During a brief respite, a hydration break under the scorching sun, they inexplicably detached themselves from the main group. They informed the translator of their need to relieve themselves, but mere moments later, the unmistakable and pungent odor of marijuana drifted on the breeze, a sickly sweet miasma that seemed to cling to the very air. One of my soldiers, Eddie Pedore, cautiously rounded the corner of the compound wall where we had sought shelter, discovering the 2A and P soldiers slumped precariously on the edge of an irrigation ditch, clearly intoxicated beyond reason on what smelled like exceptionally potent cannabis. Through the translator, I inquired, what would Najibullah say if he were to discover this? The officers merely erupted in laughter, their eyes glazed and distant, claiming that Najibullah himself had provided them with the marijuana. Initially, I dismissed their claim. The Afghans possessed a peculiar habit of fabricating pointless little lies, a subtle form of communication that conveyed either mind your own business or a more direct go to hell. It was akin to when one of my soldiers, Bill Harding, lost his Oakley sunglasses following a patrol, and days later we observed a farmer, seemingly well into his 70s, sporting an identical pair. When I inquired as to the origin of his sunglasses, he stared directly into my eyes, paused for a moment, and declared, "I made them," before shuffling away. The sheer audacity of the lie bordered on admirable, just like these officers claiming their chief gave them pot to smoke on patrol. But the unsettling truth was that Najibullah had indeed provided those two officers with a generous supply of marijuana, a reward, he claimed, for accompanying us on patrol. Upon our return from patrol, we sought an audience with Najib, intending to inform him of his pot-smoking officers. But upon entering the dilapidated Soviet-era police building he had commandeered as his headquarters, we were met with a scene more akin to a Snoop Dogg video than a police station. A scattering of A and P officers lounged around a small satellite television, casually passing around a hash pipe, their laughter echoing like that of giddy teenagers. Upon entering Najib's office, we found him seated behind his desk, his eyes bloodshot and unnervingly pink, fixated on a substantial pile of currency. And behind him, not concealed within some antiquated cloth sack, but openly displayed for all to see, lay the largest quantity of marijuana I had ever encountered. We summoned the translator and inquired as to the origin of this illicit stash. Officially, marijuana was illegal under the laws of the nascent Afghan government, but unofficially, its use was tolerated, allowing us to focus our efforts on combating the opium trade, the Taliban's primary source of revenue. Furthermore, marijuana had been an integral part of the lives of everyday Afghans for millennia. Attempting to eradicate its use would have been not only futile, but also deeply disrespectful. And beyond that, it would have been considered exceptionally rude for Najib to refuse a farmer's generous gift. But that wasn't our primary concern. Our issue was that Najib could not allow his officers to indulge in such activities while on duty, nor should he partake himself, for that matter. Najib merely rolled his eyes as the translator conveyed our scolding, promising that they would refrain from smoking while on duty from that point forward. Yet, mere days later, he reneged on his word, explaining that he needed to provide his officers with marijuana to smoke, lest they refused to venture out on patrol. It was, without question, utter horse crap. But it wasn't merely the marijuana use that troubled us. It was all that, coupled with the unsettling sight of the money that lay upon Najib's table. The funds allocated to Najib, for the express purpose of paying his officers, invariably arrived meticulously stacked, shrink-wrapped, each bill pristine and new. Yet, the currency adorning Najib's table appeared aged, creased, and well-worn. We inquired whether he was, perhaps, levying illicit taxes upon the villagers, extorting bribes under some veiled pretense. He bristled at the suggestion, vehemently asserting that the money was intended for his officers' salaries. We were soldiers, not law enforcement. Our remit extended only so far in tracing the provenance of the funds, and even were we to substantiate the claim that he was illicitly taxing the local populace, a transgression far exceeding his authorized powers, he could simply reclassify the taxes as voluntary gifts, coercing the villagers into corroborating his fabricated narrative. The chilling reality was that Najib held an iron grip on local power, though he ostensibly aided in keeping the Taliban at bay. His escalating influence bred a host of new problems. Power, I have found, demands an extraordinary degree of self-discipline. Devoid of it, one risks not only the allegiance of those under their command, but also their very self. A week, perhaps a little more, passed as we fruitlessly endeavored to elicit an admission from the villagers regarding Najib's illicit taxation. Fear clung to them like a shroud. It seemed no one would dare speak the truth. Then, abruptly, a villager stepped forward, leveling an appalling accusation. Two farmers, brothers whose families shared a compound, confirmed our lingering suspicions. Najib had indeed been taxing them, but their account descended into darker territory still. Upon discovering their family's inability to pay, Najib had allegedly abducted one of the farmer's 9-year-old twin sons as a form of collateral. The air grew thick, heavy with a dread that settled in my stomach like a stone. This sounded precisely like something Najib would do. Bill Harding, the company first sergeant, and I, accompanied by our translator, proceeded to the district center to demand the boy's release. Upon our arrival, however, we were denied entry to the office. Two visibly intoxicated Afghan National Police officers informed us that Najib was occupied, and that we should return at a later time. Through our translator, we relayed that Najib did not sound particularly busy. Given the strains of Pashtun pop music emanating from a stereo within his office, the officers remained adamant, insisting that Najib was unavailable to visitors. Ultimately, we were compelled to threaten their removal from their posts before they reluctantly relented, granting us access to the office. Bill Harding and I pushed the door inward. The scene that greeted us defied comprehension. We sought to missing boys, right? I had envisioned Najib holding them captive in the old station's communal jail cell. Yet, as we entered his office, we found Najib seated behind his desk, his shirt unbuttoned, while a small figure danced before him in time with the music. A small girl, I thought, for the child wore a dress, tiny sandals adorned with bells, and what appeared to be makeup. The same could be said for the second figure. lying motionless under a blanket on the far side of the room, their expression vacant, devoid of life. The tableau lasted a fleeting second, perhaps half a second. Then Najib registered our presence. The music ceased. He erupted in a torrent of Pashto, directed at our translator. I anticipated that our translator would allow Najib to speak, then interpret his words for us. Instead, he retorted in kind, advancing toward the dancing child. I shouted at our translator, demanding to know the girl's origins, but he remained locked in his verbal assault on Najib, who, in turn, continued his harangue. Finally, after unleashing a tirade so intense that I feared Najib would resort to violence, our translator turned to me, his face ashen. "They're not girls," he said, his voice trembling. "They're boys. The two missing boys." He then implored me to assist him in carrying the child lying in the corner, who, we discovered, was entirely naked beneath the blanket. I had to pause to physically remove myself from the moment. What I am about to relate remains the most disturbing, the most profoundly upsetting thing I have ever encountered. I offer my sincere apologies to those who will be forever scarred by what follows, and to those who doubt my veracity, I urge you to seek confirmation. Every word I am about to utter is true. In Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, certain men practice an ancient, abhorrent tradition known as bachabazi. Older men take young boys who have yet to undergo puberty, dress them as girls, and force them to dance. This might seem merely cruel, perhaps even absurd, but it descends into unspeakable depravity. After the boys have performed, the older men in attendance take turns subjecting them to acts that no adult should ever inflict upon a child, seeing it up close for the first time, yet only seeing the dancing face. Bill Harding and I had no idea what we were looking at, but our translator did, and after handing over the kid that he was carrying to Bill Harding, we had to talk him out of walking back into the police HQ and shooting Najibullah dead. As you can imagine, we reported what Najib had been doing to regimental command, but what we were told was jaw-dropping. We were told that it was an internal issue, a problem solely within the Afghans' purview to resolve. And given that Najibullah was still basking in the afterglow of his late spring triumph, none of his superiors entertained the notion of replacing him. In no uncertain terms, we were instructed to disregard it. The words themselves induced a physical revulsion, a churning in the gut. But more distressing was the utter lack of recourse. We were compelled to suppress any dissemination of this information amongst the soldiers, a weight I still carry in the dead of night. The specter of Najibullah's nocturnal activities, should it permeate the platoon, would inevitably culminate in one of my soldiers fragging him. And though I, too, harbored the desire to extinguish his life, Najibullah's demise would unleash a maelstrom of repercussions. Our sole hope lay in the possibility that some higher-ranking officer would deem it appropriate to replace him, and with haste, as Najibullah's standing amongst the villagers, who hadn't already grown to despise him, was rapidly eroding. A palpable tension filled the air. The breaking point was heralded by the desertion of several A and P officers from their posts. Not all could stomach his predilection for defiling children within the confines of his office, regardless of the monetary or narcotic inducements offered, and the horrors perpetrated within that office multiplied. Thus, one by one, his men vanished into the night, leaving only a handful of his brothers and cousins who, for the record, were also participants in these bachabazi sessions. We implored our CEO to contact Kabul, emphasizing the dire need for at least a dozen new A and P officers to maintain a semblance of security around the valley floor. But before any such action could be taken, events reached a precipice. Remember the man to whom we delivered cash compensation after his nephew dared to speak back to Najibullah and suffered a brutal beating? One day, during patrol, we observed him tending to his fields as we passed. He broke from his work and sprinted toward us, gesticulating wildly and demanding to speak with us through our translator. The farmer and our translator engaged in a protracted discussion, minutes stretching into an eternity before they finally ceased. The translator turned to me, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. He seemed to struggle for the words, the weight of his message heavy upon him. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper, I think you need to pull your guys out of the district center tonight. I demanded an explanation. He responded, trust me, take you guys out of the DC, or you will be killed. I, of course, would not be taking orders from a translator, no matter how much I respected him. I ordered him to clarify, to relay the farmer's message with precision. According to the translator, the farmer spoke in veiled terms, almost riddles, fearful of being overheard, providing information on Taliban attacks to Americans. But the essence of his warning was clear. Something cataclysmic was imminent, arriving that very night, and it would be devastating. Never one to shrink from a confrontation, I pressed our translator, questioning the basis for his assertion that we could not repel a night attack. Considering our possession of approximately $100,000 worth of night vision equipment, I did not perceive a significant threat, but the translator remained steadfast in his conviction. He insisted that we could not withstand what was coming. From the farmer's cryptic pronouncements, it seemed that every Taliban fighter in Unearth was converging upon us, likely seeking retribution for the losses they had sustained in the spring. Without delving into the intricacies of strategic considerations, suffice it to say that adequately reinforcing the DC against such a large-scale attack would necessitate abandoning the operating bases in the surrounding hills. Yet, abandoning those bases would allow the Taliban to seize our former positions, concentrate their fire upon the district center, and leave the entire company stranded. Conversely, leaving our soldiers at the DC would expose them to a concentrated assault, potentially resulting in their deaths before reinforcements could arrive. Thus, we were left with no viable option but to withdraw them, thereby leaving Najibullah and his men slightly more vulnerable than before, but still ostensibly capable of defending themselves should the need arise. That night, stationed in one of the hillside outposts, we maintained a vigil, anticipating the Taliban assault. It defied their established tactics to focus solely on the district center. Particularly given their numbers, their preferred strategy involved tying down forces in multiple locations, followed by assault teams attempting to close in once the enemy was pinned. Therefore, an attack on the district center would necessitate a simultaneous effort to contain us at the hillside outpost. Once this realization dawned, it became a matter of relentless observation, patient waiting, and unwavering readiness. Taliban attacks typically originated from the direction of the setting sun, exploiting the sun's glare to obscure their firing positions. No shots were fired at sundown, leading us to believe the attack would be delayed. Then, sometime after midnight, we detected the headlights of a truck approaching Asadabad's district center. The solitary vehicle did not immediately rouse suspicion, particularly given the expectation of a large-scale assault. However, as we watched the vehicle proceed past the district center and toward Najibullah's police HQ, it halted outside the compound's main gates. From our vantage point on the hillside, we observed the unfolding events from a distance. As the truck's headlights illuminated the interior of the compound, we figured, okay, it must have been an A&P vehicle or something, cleared for entry. A collective sigh, a shared delusion. The tension, a coiled serpent, began to loosen its grip. Perhaps the warning, that chilling premonition of an attack, had been nothing more than a phantom, a ghost story whispered in the dark. We started to relax, to breathe again. Then, out of nowhere, boom! The world dissolved into a blinding white, a searing flash, an incandescent betrayal of the night. The hillsides, moments before cloaked in impenetrable shadow, were now starkly illuminated, bathed in the unholy glow of a monstrous orange fireball that clawed its way into the heavens. From the valley floor, a silent scream ripped through the air, a sound swallowed by the immensity of the blast. We scrambled into position, adrenaline coursing through our veins, bracing ourselves for the inevitable onslaught, waiting for the storm of bullets, the relentless fire of the Taliban to tear through our defenses. But nothing. Silence. A silence more terrifying than any battle cry. A silence that pressed down, suffocating, heavy with dread. The only sound, the frantic pounding of my own heart. A desperate drumbeat against the encroaching darkness. We surmised, with chilling certainty, that it had been a bomber, a suicide truck, that had just annihilated the police HQ. A few guys from 2nd Platoon, their faces grim masks of determination, rushed down to the DC, a futile gesture against the unseen enemy, to defend against any follow-up attacks. But again, only silence answered. The morning after, a pallid dawn that revealed the true extent of the horror. The air, thick with the stench of burnt flesh and pulverized concrete. We got a good look at the damage inflicted, a landscape of utter devastation. And then, the grim task began, pulling out bodies from the police HQ. Najibullah was among them. His body, a grotesque canvas of purple and black contusions, the result of the explosion's brutal force. His head, half crushed, a macabre testament to the falling rubble. The explosive device, so immense, so devastating, that it had extinguished the lives of every police officer guarding the HQ. All but one of those inside were gone. One survivor, a broken, shattered husk of a man, thrown from his feet by the cataclysmic blast. He had landed on his neck, a sickening thud in the cacophony of destruction. He could talk, a raspy whisper escaping his mangled throat, but when we pressed him, desperate for answers, he told us he had no idea what had happened in the run-up to the explosion. Blank, empty, a void where memory should have been. But we didn't have to wait long to unravel the mystery, to piece together the puzzle of that horrific night. The Taliban, in those days, relied on cheap, disposable Motorola radios ICOMs for their clandestine communications. We, however, had learned to love those little devices, a simple matter of tuning into their frequency, eavesdropping on their plans, their boasts, their twisted ideologies. We had someone monitoring the radio traffic almost constantly, a silent observer in their shadowy world. The night before, an unnerving quiet had settled over the airwaves. They knew we were listening, always listening. Tactical silence, the calm before the storm, a deceptive lull designed to lull us into a false sense of security. But the following day, a beehive of activity. The air crackled with their triumphant chatter. The Taliban were proud, arrogant in their victory, and they had a right to be. This was their plan, meticulously crafted, flawlessly executed. First, they had sown the seeds of fear, spreading rumors of a massive, coordinated attack on Asadabad, a phantom army, a terrifying specter that kept us pinned down, paralyzed by anticipation. And then, while we were all on high alert, waiting for an attack that would never come, they simply drove a stolen A&P vehicle, a Trojan horse of death, right up to the gates of the police compound, brazenly requesting entry. They knew the A&P guys wouldn't recognize the disguised Taliban driver, so they needed a deception, a carefully constructed lie that would lower their guard, disarm their suspicion. And that thing was this. The driver, his face hidden in shadow, rolled up to the compound. When questioned, challenged on his identity and the contents of the truck, the driver, his voice a chillingly calm monotone, told the guard on duty that he had brought 3 Bachabazi boys to Najibullah as a gift for defeating the Taliban back in the spring. A sickening offering, a depraved act of calculated cruelty. This was all the guards needed to hear. A nod, a wink, a silent agreement to partake in the darkness. And then, after parking his truck, laden with its deadly cargo, right next to the HQ building, the driver simply grabbed his detonator, shouted, "God is great," and then oblivion. Blew the whole compound to kingdom come. Killing Najibullah, along with those still loyal to him, was a significant PR victory for the local Taliban, a symbol of their power, a demonstration of their unwavering resolve. And without AM officers to back us up, without any real restrictions on the smuggling, the Taliban had the upper hand, their grip tightening on the region. This made the remainder of our tour much, much tougher than it had to be. And I have no doubt in my mind that it contributed to the loss of American life during our subsequent combat operations. But without a doubt, the most significant impact it had was turning the local population violently and irreversibly against us. Under the supposed watch of the United States military, a sick, evil man had been permitted to abuse little boys, and not just on one occasion either. It's suspected that Najibullah and his officers kidnapped more than a dozen children. Before abusing them in lieu of illegal taxes, he'd imposed on their families. A festering wound of resentment, a betrayal that cut deep into the heart of the community. If someone did that to me and one of my kids, I'd do just about anything to see them dead. And I wouldn't shed a tear if the people protecting the abuser died either, especially if they'd come from some faraway place and had long outstayed their welcome. A chilling truth, a stark reality that haunted our every step. Like I said at the beginning, I can't tell you exactly how or why we lost the war in Afghanistan. I just know we wouldn't be the first great power to admit defeat there. Because as our own society begins to display some subtle and not so subtle signs of decline, perhaps Afghanistan will once again have earned its nickname as the graveyard of empires. A chilling prophecy, a haunting echo of past failures. During the summer of 1975, Bill Harding's grandfather worked at a car dealership as a mechanic in a major city on the West Coast. That was where Bill Harding's Aunt Cece got her first job as a receptionist for the dealership. They were from a small town out in the countryside, so she was excited to start work in the big city. Bill Harding's Cece had just graduated high school and wanted to save up for an apartment. Despite the fact that she was in a major city, Cece's job was what you'd expect, working as a receptionist inside a car dealership. The immediate area was devoted to industry work and other car dealerships. It was, in effect, a social dessert for a 17-year-old social butterfly like Cece. This was a blue-collar area that was predominantly dominated by men working hard and dirty jobs. And despite that, Cece enjoyed her work and the chance to carpool with her dad and get along great with the staff. With what Bill Harding's grandfather called the gift of gab, she could make friends with anybody. And now, as it was 1975, most transactions were done in cash. And as a result, paperwork and money, the deposits, a daily ritual, a trip to the bank. It felt to Cece a task woven into the fabric of her workday. She, a mere 17 years of age, entrusted with transporting vast sums, thousands of dollars in cold, hard cash, from the bustling car dealership to the bank just a walk away. A pittance now, perhaps, but in 1975, $2,000 held the weight of over $10,000 in today's inflated economy. Cece, a lone figure, traversing a somewhat desolate and edgy neighborhood within the city's sprawling confines. My grandfather, her employer, blinded by a naive optimism, blinded by the times, a different world, almost half a century removed, the 70s, and Cece, unknowingly, was about to pay the price. That summer day, lucrative. Transactions flowed like a river, depositing over $3,000 into the dealership's coffers. After lunch, the paperwork complete, Cece tucked the weighty sum into her purse. The short walk began. A few minutes in, a screech, a rusty van, brakes howling, materialized behind her. Before reaction could even form, the sliding door clattered open. A hand, rough, unyielding, pulled her in. The door slammed shut, a metallic echo. The engine roared, a beast unleashed. And just like that, swallowed whole, she was gone. Kidnapped. 5 men. Crude faces etched with a life lived hard. Mid to late 20s. Inside the van, a cavernous space where the back seats had been ripped out. A mattress lay sprawled, littered with pillows. A grotesque parody of comfort. A party van of sorts, a relic of the era's excesses, and a scene of horror. Empty beer cans rolled underfoot. The sickly sweet stench of stale alcohol and something else. Something illicit. Drug paraphernalia scattered like fallen leaves. Laughter. Cruel. Hollow. They shoved Cece onto the mattress. Jesting, their words slurred, that they had wanted a pretty girl to join their debauchery. She, the unfortunate soul who crossed their path. Oblivious, or perhaps uncaring, they had abducted a young woman. Against her will. The air grew thick with dread. There's no need to emphasize how truly dangerous a situation Cece was in. She knew. Deep in her bones, she knew. 5 strangers, taking her God knows where. These were not college boys playing pranks. Their appearance spoke of harsh realities, a brutal existence, and then a flicker of grim hope. They didn't know about the money, hidden in her purse. They sought fleeting pleasure, not financial gain. Not criminal masterminds, plotting a heist. Just depraved men looking for a good time. But if they found the cash, her chances, diminishing, rapidly. The money, a temptation too great to resist. A witness silenced. Cease did what she had always done. She kept her composure. She turned on the charm, a desperate weapon. She laughed, a strained, unnatural sound, as if this nightmare was some absurd joke. "Ah, well," she said, her voice trembling only slightly, "you guys seem pretty cool. It's too bad I can't party with you since I'm expected back at work. I mean, I'd hate for all of us to get into trouble. My boss will be mad if I'm not back soon. And he'll definitely call the cops with what's been happening lately." Ted Bundy. His name hung in the air, unspoken but ever present. The serial killer, then unidentified, stalking the West Coast. His reign of terror. Cease and her sisters, their hair cropped short, a desperate act of self-preservation. Bundy's victims. Long hair. The murders, a constant hum of fear in the city's collective consciousness. Cease used it. A lever. A wedge of doubt. Their intentions, already sinister, now complicated by the specter of immediate consequences. Her absence would be noticed. The police would be involved. Quickly, Cease continued to talk, a stream of words masking her terror, downplaying her fear. "You guys don't really want to do this, do you? My boss is really strict about my breaks, and we'll all get into trouble real soon. I don't think any of us would want that." In the end, they faltered. They weighed the risk. She wasn't worth it. They pulled over. A grocery store. The fluorescent lights hummed. The door slid open. They shoved her out. The van screeched away. Cease, clutching her purse, the $3,000 a dead weight against her side, ran. Into the store. To the phone. To her dad. The police arrived. Questions. A blur. But no identification. No license plate. The kidnappers vanished. Lost in the city's labyrinthine streets. No follow-up. The case grew cold. In retrospect, Cease's kidnapping. Perhaps not taken seriously. 1975. A mere year after women gained the right to open credit cards without male consent. Likely dismissed. A harmless prank. A joyride gone wrong. No assault. No robbery. A collective shrug. Hopefully, those men thought better of repeating their actions. But that was wishful thinking. Now I want to end this story by saying how much I love my Aunt Cease and how grateful I am that she is a part of my life. She is an incredibly brave woman who has had many adventures traveling all over the world doing photography and using her gift of gab to cultivate friendships that cross cultures and language barriers. I'm glad her narrow escape from abduction as a teenager did not diminish her adventurous spirit, but instead taught her how to survive in this very dangerous world. She has many stories, but she tells this one as a lesson in not becoming too relaxed in daily routines and in keeping emotions in check. Here's the rewritten passage, adhering to all specified requirements. And I am relaying this account to illuminate the perils that can materialize during seemingly mundane, yet frightening situations. It was the year of 2004. I, then a mere 24 years of age, found myself employed at a Taco Bell establishment. My immediate supervisor, a mere 18 years of age, presided over the managerial duties. It was, assuredly, not the zenith of my existence, but I digress. A peculiar camaraderie blossomed between the manager, whom we shall call Will Harding, and myself. The juxtaposition of my goth proclivities and his jock-like demeanor rendered us an improbable, yet harmonious pairing. He esteemed my capacity for facile communication with diverse individuals and, perhaps more superficially, my girlfriend's physical attractiveness. I, in turn, appreciated his apparent adaptability, his chameleon-like tendencies that manifested during our nocturnal sojourns to the local goth bar. He even went so far as to procure fishnet shirts for such club nights, a gesture that spoke volumes of his willingness to embrace unconventionality. Alas, as fate would have it, our friendship suffered a schism a mere 2 years into its existence. Will Harding was summarily dismissed from his position at Taco Bell for an act of harassment, a deviation from his normally perceived character. He evidently misjudged the boundaries of familiarity with one of our nocturnal female colleagues, uttering the suggestive phrase, "Hey, while you're down there," as she knelt to retrieve cheese from the reach-in refrigerator. His professional misfortunes did not end there. He was subsequently terminated from his second employment for manipulating inventory counts and pilfering Gatorade crates from the gas station where he labored during the night hours. It was during this period of tribulation that he resolved to pursue the vocation of carpentry. Embarking upon a training regimen, he acquired the requisite tools and enrolled in a vocational institution. To master the intricacies of the trade, he found solace and amusement in the company of his newfound classmates, indulging in nocturnal revelries that extended into the pre-dawn hours. By this point he was 21 years old. One ill-fated evening, whilst returning from a bar, his judgment severely impaired by alcohol, he lost control of his vehicle. He impacted a median on the freeway, resulting in a vehicular rollover and a fractured leg. The onus of rent payment and domestic upkeep fell upon my shoulders. I would not have harbored resentment had he demonstrated a modicum of consideration for cleanliness. Mold flourished in the sink, a testament to his negligence. These were, I must reiterate, dishes that I had personally purchased, and I had implored him to utilize disposable paper plates if he found himself incapable of maintaining their cleanliness. Eventually, I resorted to discarding the contaminated plates. Subsequent to his convalescence and his commencement of work as a contractor, he initiated a series of raucous gatherings, inviting acquaintances to our shared domicile, often disrupting my attempts at nocturnal repose. Inebriated beyond measure, he would instigate altercations, primarily verbal in nature, although on one occasion, he hurled a glass bottle in my direction. The atmosphere became so fraught with animosity that I deemed it prudent to relocate to my familial residence. Several years elapsed, and in the year 2012, I attained my baccalaureate degree and migrated to the northern reaches of Wisconsin to assume a position at a television broadcasting station. While partaking of breakfast at a local eerie with my girlfriend, I received a text message from a friend residing in my former locale, inquiring as to the surname of my former roommate. I responded, Harding, and transmitted a digital image. "Is this him?" he queried. "Affirmative," I replied via text. Subsequently, he dispatched an image of an entire newspaper page, an image that precipitated a wave of nausea within me. There, emblazoned upon the newsprint, was the mugshot of Will Harding, the erstwhile church-goer and aspiring carpenter-turned-thief. He had been convicted of the heinous crime of murdering his girlfriend. The narrative unfolded thus. Will Harding had been engaged in a romantic liaison with a woman employed as a clerk at the local courthouse. This woman, known for her unwavering attendance, had inexplicably absented herself from her duties for 3 consecutive days. Without providing notification, her supervisor, a retired detective, initiated a wellness check. Upon arriving at her residence, Will Harding answered the door, extending his hands in a gesture reminiscent of surrender. Law enforcement officers promptly restrained him and proceeded to inspect the premises. What they unearthed was a scene reminiscent of a Rob Zombie film. Recent repairs were evident on the drywall, and the house had been meticulously cleaned. Upon further investigation, the officers discovered black contractor bags concealed behind the drywall patch, containing dismembered remains of his skinned girlfriend. The sequence of events, as pieced together by investigators, revealed that Will Harding, in a state of alcoholic intoxication, had engaged in a heated argument with his paramour. In a fit of rage, he had hurled an ashtray at her, striking her in the head. She had subsequently fallen, impacting her head against the counter. Overcome with panic, he had determined that the optimal course of action was to strangle her to death and dismember her corpse in the basement, utilizing his reciprocating saw. However, he realized that disposing of the remains in refuse receptacles would inevitably lead to discovery. Consequently, he employed an X-Acto knife to skin the dismembered portions, concealing them within the wall cavity and patching the breach. I, in retrospect, acknowledge the perilousness of my former situation. I might very well have been his initial victim, had I not removed myself from the trajectory of his beer bottle so many years prior. I am now 31 years of age and female, and although I may not be considered old to tell you the story, I have to take you back several years. At the time of this incident, I was 24. I was working for a popular convenience store chain in my area and had managed to climb up the promotional ladder to assistant manager. Often I was the closing manager on duty, which typically wasn't an issue. I was employed in a suburban area of North Carolina and my store didn't close until 10 p.m. I had worked plenty of closing shifts despite the climbing crime rate in my area. I considered myself someone who could handle things my own. But one night, that confidence was shattered because until you actually have to handle yourself, you truly don't know if you can. I came into work that Friday at my usual start time of 3 p.m. and was scheduled to close. My last employee shift ended at 8 p.m. Typically after that time, there was nothing much to do in the store except for front-facing, cleaning, and other closing duties. And once those were finished, I usually spend my free time on my phone until it was time to lock up and clock out. Part of the closing duties involved taking the trash out to the dumpster behind the store. This night was no different. Aside from the creepy darkness, the back lot was illuminated by a single light in the parking lot. I'd never had any issues taking out the trash, and none of my employees, however, had never reported any problems either. But this night would unravel into something profoundly different. As I, Bill Harding, approached the dumpster, the heavy bags of refuse clutched in my hands. I hurled them into its cavernous depths. A sound, sickening and wet, reached my ears. A squelching. It sounded, undeniably, like an animal, devouring something. Perhaps another animal, caught in a desperate struggle. I grabbed a long, discarded stick, intending to strike the side of the dumpster, to scare away whatever abomination lurked within. I edged to the side, the air thick with an unnatural stillness, peeking cautiously round the back corner of the dumpster. And that's when my gaze locked with his. A man, crouched low, his eyes, gleaming with an unholy light, met mine. He was looking over his shoulder, a glint of steel between his teeth, a knife. As we were locked in that silent, terrifying communion, he continued to saw into something, a sickening, wet sound accompanied by a horrifying amount of blood. Not wasting a single, precious second, I maintained eye contact. A silent battle waged across the fetid air. Slowly, deliberately, I backed away. His grin widened, a grotesque display of teeth around the knife still clenched in his jaw. He began to stand. Still, I had no comprehension of what he was sawing. Honestly, I did not want to know. Locking eyes with him, I retreated faster now, my mind racing, calculating the precise moment to break and run, to flee for my life back into the relative safety of the store. About halfway across the back lot, the man, now fully erect, began walking toward me. A predatory gait. It was as if he could read my very thoughts. The instant I decided to run, he charged. I took off with every fiber of my being, every ounce of speed I could muster. Reaching the back door of the store just as he arrived, I slammed the heavy door shut, fumbling with the lock, engaging the alarm. My hands trembled violently. Shaking, I pulled out my phone, my fingers slick with sweat, and called the police. All the while, the stranger was pounding on the door, a primal, guttural sound erupting from his throat, yelling in some strange, unearthly language that was completely foreign to me. I'd never heard anything like it. About 20 minutes later, I was huddled, a trembling mass, between the aisles in the store. The entire front of the store was glass. He could see me, should he choose to look. Then, a faint tapping sound on the glass door. At first, I froze, paralyzed by fear, convinced it was the man with the knife, returned to finish what he started. But then, a voice. An officer announced his presence. Slowly, cautiously, I crept out of my hiding place and saw 3 local police officers standing there, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. I went to the door and let them in, my heart still pounding against my ribs. As we made our way to the back of the store, I explained that the assailant had stopped banging and yelling a while ago. I didn't think that he was still there, but there was no way he could have cleaned up everything behind the dumpster in that short period. I turned off the alarm and unlocked the back door, and curiosity, a morbid fascination, got the better of me. I followed, eager to see what they would find. One of the officers asked me to point to where I had seen the man. I pointed to the only dumpster in the lot, explaining that he was crouched behind it, sawing into something that was producing a horrifying amount of blood. And just as I finished explaining, another officer shone his light on the asphalt and said, "Oh, y'all got to take a look at this." We could all make out the clear impressions of bare human footprints, and what seemed to be a brownish red liquid leading across the lot toward the store. The trail faded out about halfway back, perhaps to rule out the possibility of some cruel joke. 2 officers pointed their flashlights at my feet, confirming that I was indeed wearing my non-slip black work shoes and had no blood on me. Approaching the dumpster, one officer positioned himself in front of me while the others drew their weapons. One of them shouted in a very stern voice, "Police officer, if you're back there, show yourself. Come out with your hands up." There was no response. As they turned the corner, they all sighed in unison, and what they found was a pool of blood, a knife, but no person. There was no animal or body, just blood, and a lot of it. They cordoned off the scene with yellow crime scene tape and began gathering some evidence, eventually allowing me to leave after giving my statement. The man behind the dumpster was apprehended a couple of days later, from what I heard. In his own home, which was only a few miles from the store, he was arrested and questioned, and after hours of interrogation, the man admitted to abducting and killing a child from his trailer park. What I witnessed was the dismemberment of this child. His pursuit of me was to ensure that if I had seen something, I wouldn't be able to talk about it. After the incident, I refused to close the store again, and my store manager agreed. Not long after, I took a position at another store within the same company in what seemed to be a safer area. I have been into urban exploration, or urbux for short, for a couple of years now. Living in Europe, specifically Germany, there are always reasonably nearby sites to visit. I started by venturing into well-researched urbex areas with my friends. At the time, I was a teenage girl who was afraid to explore alone, afraid of being assaulted, kidnapped, mugged, or murdered. Eventually, after about a year of urbexing with friends, I decided I was competent enough to explore on my own. I become knowledgeable about what safety measures to take. For instance, wearing equipment like masks when entering old buildings due to the likelihood of asbestos particles being present. One should also wear thick clothes and sturdy shoes to avoid stepping on or bumping into anything sharp and harmful. I always scoped out the buildings and pre-planned entry and exit routes. Additionally, I shared my location with one of my closest friends every time I went on an adventure. I had successfully several times alone and covered many abandoned places across eastern Germany. However, in July 2018, things went very wrong. It was the apex of summer. Having exhausted nearly every locale within a reasonable distance, I was compelled to resort to more laborious methods of discovery. My research led me to wartime bunkers scattered throughout Germany, relics of the Second World War. One, nestled deep within a forest a 3-hour drive from my city, piqued my interest. Certain of its existence, I felt a surge of triumph upon arrival, akin to a true explorer unearthing ancient artifacts. The bunker, constructed entirely of concrete, bore no visible signs of intrusion, leading me to believe it remained undiscovered. An hour was consumed in the effort to breach its defenses, fiddling with the door, striking it with stones, even offering a silent prayer, until finally, it yielded. The ease of entry was almost unsettling. Donning my headlamp, mask, and gloves for added protection, I stepped inside. Even through the mask, the air was thick with the stench of decay, as if something had recently expired within. The interior was surprisingly vast, the floor strewn with discarded papers and debris. A growing unease settled upon me when, in one of the sleeping quarters, I discovered a pillow, slightly torn. Lifting it, I realized it was filled with hair. Human hair, I surmised. A wave of dread washed over me, the immediate assumption being that it was the hair of Jewish prisoners from a bygone era. The horrors they must have endured filled my thoughts. A sudden urge to flee gripped me, but I forced myself to remain, unwilling to have driven 3 hours for naught. Drawing my gaze from the pillow, I scanned the room, noticing something incongruous. It was an empty can of beans, a plastic spoon resting within, the label remarkably vibrant. I cautiously picked it up to examine it, noting the expiration date, July 11th, 2018. A chill ran down my spine, but I dismissed it as evidence of a previous explorer. However, as I ventured deeper, more signs of modern habitation presented themselves: food packaging, relatively new clothing, an empty air freshener can. The stench of rot intensified with each step. Upon entering the next room, a putrid wave assaulted my senses, threatening to overwhelm me. Recovering, I surveyed the scene, recoiling at the sight of 3 bodies. The initial thought was squatters, but it was immediately clear they were deceased. An older man, heavy-set, a woman of similar age, and most disturbingly, a young boy, perhaps 9 years old. Their bodies were bloated, their skin a ghastly purple and waxy. They barely resembled humans. The man lay supine, his abdomen mutilated, clad only in khaki trousers. The image of his exposed entrails, desiccated and nearly black, would forever haunt me. The woman was completely nude, her body covered in contusions. Blood stained her private parts. Her breasts had been removed. Her vacant stare pierced me, and with horror. The child's face was unrecognizable, covered in dried brain matter and blackened blood. Tears welled in my eyes, and a sob escaped my lips. Breathing became a conscious effort. 1,000 thoughts collided within my mind. What if the perpetrator remained nearby? What if they discovered me, and would I meet the same gruesome fate as this unfortunate family? I attempted to contact emergency services, but there was no signal. In my panicked state, I made the decision to photograph the scene before fleeing the bunker as quickly as possible. I didn't even bother to secure the door. I simply ran. To my utter horror, I froze, hearing footsteps that were not my own. I crouched behind a fallen tree, able to see the bunker entrance if I dared to peek. A male voice, seething with rage, echoed through the trees. I wasn't expecting visitors. He spat in German before stomping into the bunker. Relief washed over me, and that he hadn't bothered to scout the area first. Believing he was far enough inside not to hear me, I sprinted away as fast as my body would allow. The road, a 30-minute walk from the bunker, seemed an eternity away. Just as I reached it, a blood-curdling scream tore through the air, followed by the sound of pursuit. Panic seized me, and the image of the crazed murderer fueled my desperate run. I summoned every ounce of strength, crawling onto the road and towards my car, which was approximately 200 meters away. My keys were in my backpack, my trembling hands fumbling with the zipper. Finally, I retrieved them, glancing up to see his figure emerging from the forest. He appeared to be in his 60s, tall, perhaps 180 centimeters, and powerfully built. In his hand, he brandished a large, well-worn knife. I scrambled into my car, locking the doors just as he slammed against the window. Pounding on the glass, spewing curses, his crazed blue eyes wide and bloodshot, I started the engine and sped away, exceeding 140 kilometers per hour. Disregarding the speed limit, grateful that he hadn't thought to slash my tires and focused solely on screaming at me, I drove until I reached the nearest petrol station. I called my father, relaying everything. I had only recently moved out, being just 20 years old, and he met me, and there, following that harrowing escape, exceeding all limits of speed and sanity, I went to the authorities. I presented the photographs, each a stark testament to the horrors I had witnessed. I described the man, his depraved features etched into my memory, and provided the precise coordinates of that unholy bunker. They assured me that they would investigate, but I never received any confirmation, any closure. The aftershocks of that experience reverberate through my existence to this day. I have never again succumbed to the lure of urbucks. For an extended period, venturing out alone became an unbearable ordeal. Therapy became a necessary crutch, a means of grappling with the profound trauma. Even now, more than 5 years later, the spectral images of those victims, the abuser's malevolent eyes, and the gravelly rasp of his sinister voice continue to haunt my dreams, twisting them into grotesque nightmares. To begin, this narrative requires a degree of exposition. I had considered sharing these accounts previously, but recent events have compelled me to unburden myself. I am currently employed at a data destruction company. We furnish our clientele with capacious receptacles, into which they deposit any sensitive information destined for oblivion. Our drivers collect these bins, and we then meticulously segregate the paper from any extraneous materials, such as trash or folders. We also maintain a loading dock where individuals can deliver items directly. Subsequently, all material is transferred to the shredding floor, my designated domain. The shredders are colossal, capable of obliterating up to 2 tons of paper daily. I apologize for the logistical detour, but contextual understanding is paramount to the narrative's coherence. And no, this isn't a tale of some horrific shredding mishap. But I digress. As one might surmise, the documents entrusted to our destruction are considered sensitive, or even classified, regardless of whether they are innocuous junk mail. Bank statements, medical records, scholastic transcripts, court documents, virtually anything imaginable. 90% of the material I encounter daily is mundane, warranting only the briefest of glances before being consigned to the shredder's maw. However, there are occasional glimpses into the extraordinary. In the 4 months I have been employed here, I have unearthed Social Security cards dating back to the 1930s and 40s, report cards from the 1950s, rosary beads, religious pamphlets from the 1940s predictably rife with sexism, condoms thankfully unused, a family photo album from the 1970s documenting a pilgrimage to Disneyland, and even currency. The largest cash amounted to $11,000, inadvertently discarded by a family following their matriarch's passing. In such instances, we endeavor to locate the rightful owners and return the funds. The majority of recovered cash is allocated to an employee Christmas party fund. These are merely the mildly intriguing elements within a vast expanse of tedium. However, there exists a more somber facet to our work. Seldom does one ponder the ultimate fate of crime scene photographs or autopsy reports. Once their official purpose has been served, as you might anticipate, they eventually find their way to my shredder. I am no stranger to the macabre or disturbing. After all, I am submitting this to this subreddit, but certain images are indelible, impossible to erase from the mind's eye. Experience number 1. On one occasion, whilst sorting through heaps of paper alongside a co-worker, something arrested our attention. A large folder had disgorged its contents, revealing a stack of approximately 20 pages, each featuring a full-color, page-sized image that collectively told a horrifying story. The setting was a warehouse dominated by a large, crimson container seemingly filled with ashes. As we progressed through the photographs, we saw him. Amidst the ashes was a highly visible vest, and within the vest, the charred remains of a human being. From what we could ascertain, this man had either fallen or been deliberately propelled into an incinerator. The subsequent images depicted him reduced to a blackened husk, with close-up shots of his genitals, face, hands, and a ruptured abdomen exposing his intestinal tract. Experience number 2. Given our practice of separating trash from paper, we accumulate large bins filled exclusively with refuse, folders, binders, glossy advertisements, printed photographs, VHS tapes, CDs, Polaroids, virtually everything imaginable. These items often contain sensitive information and must therefore be destroyed separately to prevent contamination of recyclable materials. Consequently, we periodically designate trash shredding days. These days are my favorite, as they invariably yield the most intriguing discoveries. I was thus engaged in the process of trash shredding when I encountered some plastic pages designed to hold Polaroids, akin to a sleeve for Pokémon cards. I examined the Polaroids and, after a moment of horrified realization, found myself staring at a torso riddled with stab wounds. There were a dozen or so Polaroids, each depicting a different murder victim. Gunshot wounds, suicides, slit throats, accidents. 2 images were particularly jarring. One depicted a woman who had fallen backward off a stepladder and suffered internal decapitation. Upon striking the wall behind her, the sheer randomness of this freak accident was both humbling and deeply unsettling. The other portrayed a completely nude woman, her head encased in duct tape, her hands and feet similarly restrained. Only her forehead and the bridge of her nose were visible, her eyebrows frozen in an expression of abject terror and pain. There are numerous other sights I have witnessed here that continue to haunt me, and But perhaps I, and will recount those on another occasion. One of the most challenging aspects is the feeling of isolation, the inability to share these experiences with others. I, and never anticipated that a job as a paper shredder would expose me, and to such a profoundly dark side of humanity. It was the summer of 1978, and we had just relocated from Canada to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. As a 7-year-old child, I, and was filled with excitement at the prospect of living in a new country, and the adventures that awaited me, and little did I, and know that one of my first adventures would be so sinister. We ended up staying at the Hilton Hotel with other expat families while we awaited the company's provided residence to become habitable. For a second grader, such a protracted sojourn, spanning 1 to 2 weeks, possessed an undeniable allure, resembling a lavish camping expedition. The Hilton, teeming with other expatriate families, provided a plethora of potential playmates. Hide-and-seek became our favored diversion, its boundaries extending to the labyrinthine corridors of the 30-odd floors, accessible via the hotel's elevators, or the shadowed recesses of the stairwells. The hotel, in its deceptive grandeur, fostered a false sense of security within us, the children. One day, during one such game, I found myself alone in the elevator, ascending to the uppermost reaches of the building, the 30th floor, I believe it was. As the doors hissed open and I rounded the corner, an encounter of the most unsettling kind transpired. A man and a woman, seemingly in their late 30s, stood before me, their countenances suggesting they were native to this land. They possessed no inherently frightening features and were, in fact, dressed with a certain degree of refinement. Yet, their subsequent actions belied their innocuous appearance. The man, without preamble, attempted to seize my arm. I recoiled, pulling away from his grasp. A slow retreat ensued, until a distance of perhaps 10 to 15 feet separated us. The impulse to flee was overwhelming, yet the chilling realization that escape was, in reality, an illusion paralyzed me, and a brief, unnerving standoff commenced. I surmised that the man sought to entice my voluntary compliance, for a scream would surely shatter the uneasy calm of the floor, attracting unwanted attention. And so, from across the expanse, we stared, locked in a silent, desperate battle of wills. I stood closest to the bank of elevators, the promise of escape tantalizingly near, while they stood positioned between me and the shadowed descent of the stairwell. The man produced a chocolate bar from his pocket, extending it in an unspoken invitation. To accept would require a perilous approach, a transgression I was unwilling to contemplate. The couple's smiles, strained and unnatural, sent a shiver down my spine. Their body language's silent threat, "We may lunge at you at any moment." An inconsequential detail, perhaps, yet etched indelibly in my memory. The chocolate bar contained nuts, an ingredient I despised. As my refusal became evident, the man's posture shifted, his intent hardening into a prelude to attack. The time to run had arrived. Just as the man seemed poised to launch himself forward, the elevator doors chimed, announcing the arrival of another passenger. Their identity, their very appearance, remained shrouded in the mists of time. As soon as I heard the sound, I turned and bolted past that person, diving into the open elevator. The man and woman retreated in the opposite direction, vanishing into the labyrinthine corridors, perhaps seeking refuge in their room or the shadowed depths of the stairwell. The incident remained a secret, locked away for decades, until finally released into the light. As a child, I buried it deep within the recesses of my mind, not to be unearthed until years had passed. It is sobering to reflect upon how the smallest, seemingly insignificant moments can alter the course of one's life. I may not recall the identity of that elevator passenger, but I remain eternally indebted to their fortuitous rival. Now I work at a large retail establishment, a self-checkout host. My days are consumed by endless circuits of the area, punctuated by the monotonous refrain of customers declaring, "I don't work here," or questioning my presence at the register. Their frustrations are understandable. Typically, a complement of 2 or 3 of us ANs staffed the self-checkout area, supplemented by perhaps demand registers. We gained a new employee, whom we'll call Bill Harding. Bill Harding consistently wore a mask, a lingering precaution from the anxieties of 2021. I was tasked with his training, instructing him, Bill Harding, in the mundane tasks of stocking candy and bags. Bill Harding, posed the usual inquiries, my and's educational pursuits, my and's romantic entanglements. And explained that I resided in a small city, big town, home to a reputable college, drawing students from across the nation, many of whom ultimately found employment in the local prisons or retail establishments. I reciprocated with similar questions. To both his inquiries, I replied in the negative. Then Bill Harding, inquired whether I ever engaged in hunting. The surrounding landscape, I explained, was dominated by vast woodlands and a sprawling forest. No, I don't care for guns, I stated. Bill Harding, responded that Bill Harding, would have to take me, and one day. A few days elapsed, and Bill Harding, approached me, and again. Bill Harding, inquired as to whether I had family in town, and if not, whether they resided nearby. I informed him, Bill Harding, that I lived merely 3 doors down from my mother. Bill Harding, then resumed his discourse on hunting, recounting expeditions with Bill Harding's companions, employing pack tactics to corner and dispatch their prey. The strategy seemed incongruous for deer, creatures typically inclined to flee at the slightest disturbance. Bill Harding, was absent for several days, a common occurrence for new hires struggling to secure sufficient hours during their initial weeks. I confided in a colleague, who revealed that Bill Harding, had been asking a multitude of questions about me, and the subsequent encounter with him, Bill Harding, was marked by pointed inquiries. How tall would you say you are, and how much do you weigh, and how well do you know the woods past such and such street? I am a sizable individual, 6 feet tall and 300 pounds. And when Bill Harding, broached the subject of hunting once more, a chilling premonition gripped me, and, come on, man, you'd like it, and just some good old boys shooting the breeze late at night in the middle of the woods. And then the real fun starts right before dawn. They won't know what hit him, and the mask concealed most of Bill Harding's face, but I could discern the subtle upward curve of Bill Harding's lips as Bill Harding, smiled. I cannot fathom why Bill Harding, believed this to be a persuasive argument. Aside from the unsettling implication that I was to be the hunted, the prospect sounded utterly tedious, and I must have betrayed my unease beforehand, for Bill Harding, turned abruptly and departed. I informed a few colleagues of the incident, but that was Bill Harding's final day, and I never encountered him, Bill Harding, again. I harbor the fervent hope that our paths never cross. So, for context, years prior, my mother accepted a position at a local laundromat, an arrangement facilitated by our acquaintance with the owner, and our pressing need for additional income. I was approximately 10 years of age when my mother, commenced her employment, and my mother, permitted me to accompany her, offering a small allowance for my assistance with minor tasks. I ultimately accompanied her, my mother, every evening for years, and as I matured, my primary motivation became ensuring my mother's safety, fueled by anxieties regarding her well-being. My mother and I, frequently dealt with irate patrons who refused to vacate the premises, many of whom were inebriated or under the influence of illicit substances, necessitating several calls to the authorities. My mother consistently expressed concern about my accompanying her, but I remained insistent, and to this day I cannot confess to any regrets. Much good arose from the experience, principally the valuable work ethic instilled, which compensated for the intensity of the environment. I possess a plethora of intriguing anecdotes from that era, but this particular narrative reigns supreme as the most horrifying, an event that transpired when I was approximately 12 years old. In my youthful naivete, I, and appointed myself the guardian of closing time, responsible for dispersing lingering individuals. We, my mother and I, regularly encountered individuals parking behind the establishment. Thus I, and would proceed to the side of the building and commence shouting that they were trespassing, and that I, and would summon the constabulary if they, the lingering individuals, did not depart. I, and deem this detail crucial, for I, and now recognize that I, and inadvertently alerted any dubious characters lurking near the building at night to my, and's, presence, a precarious undertaking for a 12-year-old girl. I, and remained blissfully ignorant of any potential harm until one evening when we, my mother and I, arrived to discover the door lock compromised. My mother had unlocked the establishment that morning, precluding any possibility of a break-in attempt, given that it had remained unlocked throughout the day. We, my mother and I, were understandably unnerved, but my mother contacted her employer via text message to inform him of the situation, and instructed me, and to alert her, my mother, if I, and observed anyone approaching. Approximately 30 minutes elapsed after I, and completed my, and's, few assigned tasks and settled down to sketch in my, and's, sketchbook. I, and had scarcely been seated for a few minutes when I, and perceived the door swing inward, an occurrence that startled me, and, as patrons typically knocked upon observing the conspicuously displayed closed sign. My mother, too, noticed the intrusion and announced that we, my mother and I, were closed. I, and discerned the voice of an older gentleman responding, explaining that he had merely entered to utilize our beverage dispensing machine. We, my mother and I, typically permitted individuals to access our snack and beverage vending machines. Thus, my mother informed him that he, the older gentleman, had a few moments and retreated to the storage closet to retrieve an item. I, and was positioned approximately 7 feet from the beverage machine, and I, and overheard him, the older gentleman, approach, but I, and paid him, the older gentleman, scant attention. I, and continued to sketch until I, and began to experience the sensation of being watched and realized that I, and had not heard him, the older gentleman, deposit any currency into the beverage machine. I, and nervously glanced to my, and's, left and beheld a tall man, appearing to be in his mid-60s, staring directly at me, and with an unnervingly broad smile adorning his face. I, and recoiled slightly, forced an awkward smile in return, and redirected my, and's, attention to my, and's, drawing. Immediately upon doing so, I, and heard a sound akin to shuffling, and upon glancing over once more, I, and observed that he, the tall man, had drawn closer. I, and was paralyzed with indecision, and I, and attempted to avert my, and's, gaze. But each time I, and looked away, he, the tall man, would shuffle nearer. His, the tall man's, body remained oriented toward the beverage machine, but his, the tall man's, neck was craned in my, and's, direction, and he, the tall man, maintained his unwavering smile and stare. I, and commenced to tremble, gripped by panic, and my, and's, eyes darted back and forth between him, the tall man, and the closet door as I, and desperately formulated an escape strategy. I, and reached for my, and's, knife, which I, and typically carried in my, and's, bag as I, and could scarcely fathom the intentions of this man, the tall man, and I, and swiftly realized that it was absent. I, and had inadvertently left my, and's, knife at home during my, and's, hour of greatest need, and I, and was petrified. I, and resolved to simply stare back at him, the tall man, despite being consumed by terror and trembling violently. And after what seemed an eternity, he, the tall man, abruptly broke eye contact and exclaimed to my mother, "Have a good night," before pivoting and departing. A wave of relief washed over me, and instantly, and I, and attempted to regain my, and's, composure after the ordeal. I, and believed myself to be finally safe, and began to rise to splash some water upon my, and's, face when I, and espied him, the tall man, seated on the bench outside. Panic and dread struck me, and like a physical blow, and I, and sprinted into the closet to conceal myself. I, and recounted the entire incident to my mother, and she instructed me, and to run to the car, promising to position herself between me and him, the tall man. and employ pepper spray if necessary. I and followed her instructions and fled to the car, and as I and passed him, the tall man rose and commenced walking toward the vehicle. My mother commanded him, the tall man, to vacate her vehicle's vicinity, and his, the tall man's, response was to attempt to engage in a calm conversation regarding the make and model of her vehicle, while fixing his gaze upon me, and she, my mother, ignored him. The tall man entered the car, secured the locks, and began reversing as rapidly as feasible. I and ducked down in my seat, yet I and could still perceive him, the tall man, standing there, and I and am certain that he, the tall man, could see me, and because I and watched as he, the tall man, and I watched him, Bill Harding, raise his hand, a gesture of farewell, before he, Bill Harding, rounded the building's rear, dissolving into the oppressive darkness. A wave of nausea washed over me, and sleep offered no solace that night, and I and never again dared to venture near that building's shadowed backside. A lesson, perhaps, learned in the crucible of childhood terror. This occurred 2 decades prior. I and was but 9 years of age, yet my parents, too, have recounted their perspective on numerous occasions. My parents, both biologists, forged their bond within the sterile confines of their workplace, a union that blossomed into matrimony. The institution where they toiled was a government edifice, dedicated to biological research for public projects, meaning they, my parents, were tasked with scrutinizing the environment and formulating the environmental protection laws derived from their findings. This imposing, aged government structure invariably hosted a security guard, a sentinel present day and night. During daylight hours, these custodians primarily occupied the reception area, extending greetings to visitors. However, under the cloak of night, they embarked on their rounds, ensuring the absence of intruders, a necessity given the expensive scientific instruments and computers housed within. One such guard was Bill Harding, the man best left unencountered. Initially, he, Bill Harding, projected an aura of amiable benevolence. He, Bill Harding, treated me, and with kindness and truthfully my recollections of him. Bill Harding, prior to this incident, were uniformly pleasant. He, Bill Harding, would greet me and engage in affable conversation each time my parents brought me and to their place of employment. He, Bill Harding, crafted paper airplanes for me, and a skill at which he, Bill Harding, proved surprisingly adept, launching them with me and in playful abandon. He, Bill Harding, would remain with me and in the reception area on those evenings when my parents were compelled to work into the late hours. Naturally, such enforced idleness rapidly descended into tedium for a boy of 9, and thus he, Bill Harding, would provide companionship and amusement. Predominantly, we, Bill Harding and would converse, manipulate paper airplanes, and watch television, activities that seemed harmless enough, sufficiently harmless, it would appear, for my parents to entrust me, and to his, Bill Harding's, care, a decision that, in retrospect, may have been their gravest error. One evening, my parents were required to work even later than was customary. The clock, I believe, approached 10 in the evening, yet their labors remained unfinished. Consequently, Bill Harding, the guard assigned to the night shift, proposed escorting me and around the building during his, Bill Harding's, rounds. We, Bill Harding and commenced our circuit on the uppermost floor, inspecting each chamber along the building's outer perimeter. Each room was so devoid of light that I invariably lagged behind, awaiting his, Bill Harding's, activation of the illumination. Subsequently, we, Bill Harding and descended to the second floor, where my parents' offices and laboratories were situated. We, Bill Harding and examined the opposite side of the structure, venturing into laboratories replete with massive extractors, microscopes, and every conceivable scientific apparatus. We, Bill Harding and proceeded down the stairwell to the first floor, the domain of administrative offices. I retain vivid memories of maps adorning the walls and embalmed fish serving as macabre decorations. The first floor was deemed secure, thus necessitating an inspection of the 2 basement levels. It, too, seemed logical to inspect the laboratories on the right side first. as the left side terminated in a staircase leading to my parents. But for reasons that remain inscrutable, he, Bill Harding, elected to explore that side first. We, Bill Harding and scrutinized each laboratory, yet I detected an acceleration in his, Bill Harding's, pace, accompanied by an increasing air of levity, verging on excitement. Once more, we, Bill Harding examined each laboratory, each corner, proceeding from one extremity to the other, activating the lights in advance and extinguishing them upon our, Bill Harding and departure. Upon reaching the final area, he, Bill Harding, illuminated all the lights and we, Bill Harding entered. 3 distinct offices lined each side of the laboratory, and in the first, he, Bill Harding, hastened toward the printer, extracted to sheets of paper, and rapidly fashioned to paper airplanes. It was at this juncture that everything irrevocably changed. He, Bill Harding, retrieved one of the airplanes, exited the office, and launched it toward the room's far end. He, Bill Harding, then declared that the launched plane was mine, and that we, Bill Harding could engage in aerial play within the confines of that room. I dashed to the room's opposite side to retrieve my plane, eager to commence our game, when suddenly the lights were extinguished. I wheeled around to ascertain the cause, only to witness him, Bill Harding, exiting the laboratory, deactivating the lights, and securing the door. I lunged at the door, striking and kicking it while screaming for him, Bill Harding, to unlock it, panic seizing me, and due to my profound fear of darkness. Through the glass pane in the door, I observed him, Bill Harding, scurrying away down the corridors, extinguishing the lights as he, Bill Harding, progressed, vanishing after rounding a corner. I am reasonably certain that every sensation, every shadow, every monstrous figment I perceived within that room while awaiting rescue was a product of my terrified imagination. I cowered in a corner, perceiving shadows swirling around me and in the dark. I could only weep, lost and bereft of understanding as to the events transpiring and the motivations underlying his, Bill Harding's, actions. My parents, eventually concluding their labors, gathered their belongings and proceeded to the lobby to collect me and return home. Upon their arrival, the security guard, Bill Harding, was present at reception, yet I was nowhere to be found. My parents, understandably succumbed to panic, likely directing a litany of expletives at him. Bill Harding, I remain uncertain as to why my father did not summarily execute him, Bill Harding, then and there. But upon their initial inquiry as to my whereabouts and his, Bill Harding's, role in my disappearance, he, Bill Harding, simply stated that he, Bill Harding, had gone to do the rounds with me and that I must have gotten lost somewhere. A building of such proportions, a comprehensive check from top to bottom, would consume no less than 90 minutes, even at a hurried pace. So, the suggestion that I must have simply gotten lost offered little solace. Hours unfurled, an agonizing expanse of time during which they searched, their efforts proving fruitless. It was only then, when a distant light flickered at the far end of the corridors leading to the laboratory where I was imprisoned, that I summoned the courage to rise, to rush towards the door, and to beat upon it with all the force I could muster. My parents, finally discovered me, and compelled the guard, Bill Harding, to unlock the door and release me, sleep offered no refuge that night, or if it did, it came only as a consequence of utter exhaustion. But I know with absolute certainty that I insisted my mother remain in the bedroom with me, throughout its entirety. Unsurprisingly, my parents lodged a formal complaint against the guard, Bill Harding, and during the subsequent investigation, he, Bill Harding, was promptly terminated and apprehended, not solely for the act of confining me, a deed for which he, Bill Harding, likely hoped I would remain undiscovered, but for a more insidious transgression, his, Bill Harding's, collusion with other criminals in the surreptitious theft of computers and equipment from the building. These stolen goods were then sold in clandestine markets, along with sensitive information extracted from the hard drives, all for personal gain. But then he, Bill Harding, had stolen a lot of old computers without anyone realizing. And who knows what his, Bill Harding's, plans were for me. And that night, I remain unconvinced that locking a weeping child in the heart of darkness, concealed within some forgotten room, constitutes normal behavior if one does not intend to conceal them and retrieve them, and later, when all others have departed, to sell them, and as part of your product. This harrowing incident occurred during my high school years. It was a Wednesday evening, a night typically reserved for youth group at my church, and for my mother's date night with her own mother, a tradition of playing cards, watching television, and sharing companionship. This usually meant they might be gone until approximately 9 or 9:30 every Wednesday night. For reasons I cannot fully articulate, both of us, my mother and I, decided to remain at home that night. I was downstairs in my mother's room in the basement, watching television with her. We also had a roommate at this time, and Cinnamon was his dog. The roommate was absent that night. He was, by nature, a creature of the night. Consequently, when he, the roommate, was away, Cinnamon would seek solace and companionship with one of us, my mother or me, and I slept on a full-sized futon frame at this time. So even though it was a tight fit for myself, and in a big old pit bowl, I always embraced the opportunity to have her, Cinnamon, sleep with me, and she, Cinnamon, was and remains a truly exceptional dog. It was approximately 8:30. It is crucial to remember that we, my mother and I, would typically be absent from the house at this hour, and our roommate was also not present, and I decided to retire for the night. The architectural layout of our house dictated that one would ascend a set of stairs, reach a landing, and then ascend another set of stairs, at which point one would have a clear view through the kitchen and living room, and could observe the front door. So, Cinnamon and I were ascending the stairs to my room when we reached the landing. As soon as we did, Cinnamon emitted a loud, sharp bark and bolted up the remaining flight of stairs. I looked up and saw her, Cinnamon, racing through the kitchen. And as I did, our front door burst open, swinging wide and slamming against the wall with violent force. Then I saw a man clad entirely in black, his face obscured by a hood, his hands concealed within black gloves, fleeing out of the door frame, across our porch and entryway, down our front steps, and disappearing into the darkness of the sidewalk. Cinnamon stood barking ferociously at our screen door to our porch. It was a rapid, deafening, and utterly shocking event, and the winter night was pitch black, rendering my vision limited. I saw little else due to the darkness and the sheer velocity of the incident. But I ran over and slammed the front door shut, secured the deadbolt, and then, taking Cinnamon with me, retreated to my room and locked the bedroom door. I called my mother and recounted the harrowing events from upstairs, and she instructed me to lock the door and remain in my room. That night, sleep offered little respite. I remained vigilant, straining to detect any noise or footsteps outside my window. And I swore I heard things, unsettling sounds that defied explanation. But ultimately, nothing further transpired. I spent the night huddled close to Cinnamon, expressing my gratitude for her protection and for her imposing presence as a pit bull, even though she, Cinnamon, was always so gentle and affectionate. And I will never forget that.